Introduction. Our modern society is built upon the gentle ideals of democracy, cooperation, and universal fairness. From an early age, we are conditioned to believe that harmony is the highest social good, and that those who display overt aggression are destined for isolation and public scorn. This agreeable facade is constantly reinforced by the literature of success and the polished, untroubled images projected by those who have climbed to the heights of power. The public sphere is saturated with an overriding demand for correctness and peaceful coexistence. Yet, this noble conditioning leaves us profoundly ill-equipped for the harsh reality of the world as it truly is. We have been rigorously trained for a life of peace, but what we actually face every single day is a state of perpetual war. This state of conflict operates on multiple, overlapping planes. The most obvious battles are those waged against clear competitors and external rivals in an increasingly ruthless global arena, whether in the halls of politics, the boardrooms of business, or the fierce struggles within the arts. Far more insidious and troubling, however, are the conflicts that occur close to home, involving the very individuals who claim to stand by our side. The world is filled with supposed allies who feign team loyalty and project a warm, cooperative exterior, only to quietly sabotage our efforts behind the scenes to advance their own hidden agendas. There are also those masters of subtle warfare who employ passive aggressiveness as a deadly weapon, offering promises of support that never materialize or wielding guilt to manipulate our actions. While the surface of our social interactions may appear tranquil, a fierce, every-person-for-themselves dynamic churns just beneath it, infiltrating even our most intimate relationships and family structures. It is not that humanity is inherently wicked, or that we have somehow failed our highest moral callings. The simple truth is that we are driven by aggressive, self-interested impulses that can never be fully repressed. In bygone eras, individuals could rely on the protective embrace of the state, the extended family, or the loyal corporation. Those days are gone. In a world stripped of such safety nets, we are forced to prioritize our own survival and well-being. Clinging to impossibly pure ideals of peace only generates dangerous confusion. What we require is an unvarnished, practical understanding of how to navigate the inevitable frictions of human interaction. This does not mean reverting to brutal force or blind tyranny. Rather, it demands a rational, calculating approach to conflict. By channeling our aggressive drives instead of denying their existence, we can aspire to a higher archetype. The strategic warrior, an individual who navigates a treacherous world through deft, intelligent maneuver rather than brute emotional force. Sociologists and psychologists have long observed that conflict, rather than being an evil to be avoided, is often the very mechanism through which genuine problems are resolved and deep differences are reconciled. The trajectory of our lives, our triumphs and our defeats, is largely determined by our competence in handling these unavoidable struggles. The most common responses to friction, running away from it, exploding in emotional outbursts, or descending into petty, uncalculated manipulation, inevitably backfire because they are untethered from conscious, rational control. The strategic warrior operates on an entirely different plane. Such individuals are anchored by their long-term objectives. They possess the wisdom to distinguish between battles that must be fought and those that must be bypassed. When engagement is absolutely necessary, they execute their maneuvers with a subtle indirection, masking their machinations so thoroughly that they maintain the very facade of peace so prized by modern society. This refined concept of rational combat traces its lineage back to the battlefields of antiquity. In its earliest iterations, war was little more than a chaotic, blood-soaked theater for individual heroism and unrestrained brutality. However, as tribes coalesced into complex states, the devastating hidden costs of blind warfare became impossible to ignore. Waging campaigns on pure adrenaline frequently resulted in mutual annihilation. A more logical, calculated approach was desperately needed. The ancient Greeks codified this evolution with the concept of the strategos, the leader of the army. This was the birth of generalship, the intellectual mastery of the entire war effort. It involved the deliberate orchestration of forces, the leveraging of terrain, and the crafting of maneuvers designed to secure a decisive advantage. Military minds soon realized that rigorous foresight and imaginative planning unlocked infinite possibilities. Through strategic brilliance, a commander could systematically dismantle an empire of vastly superior size. This sparked a constant upward pressure in the arms race of the mind. To defeat a cunning adversary, a leader had to become even more indirect, inventive, and strategically profound. While the terminology may be Greek, the essence of strategy transcends geography and era. Across the ancient world, from the disciplined legions of Rome to the vast plains of Asia, universal patterns of warfare began to emerge. The flanking maneuver, the deceptive retreat, and the calculated counterattack became the shared currency of military genius. Among the greatest architects of this mindset was the ancient Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu. His writings distilled a myriad of strategic principles into a unified philosophy, culminating in the ultimate ideal: achieving victory without spilling a single drop of blood. By systematically dismantling an opponent's psychological resolve, inducing paralyzing confusion, and maneuvering them into untenable positions, the true strategist forces a mental surrender long before physical collapse becomes necessary. Campaigns fought with such elegant economy of force, where resources are preserved and lives are spared, stand as the pinnacle of strategic mastery. Organized warfare is not an isolated phenomenon locked away in history books. It is a vivid reflection of human nature at its most extreme. The evolution of military tactics toward unconventional, asymmetrical, and psychological warfare perfectly mirrors the complexities of modern social and professional arenas. The principles that have toppled empires and won sweeping campaigns are rooted in timeless human psychology, and they hold infinite practical relevance for the silent wars we fight every day. There will always be voices arguing that the study of war is a barbaric relic, and that applying military strategy to daily life only breeds further hostility in an already fractured world. This pacifist perspective is deeply alluring, but it is dangerously naive. Predators and manipulators will always walk among us, employing whatever means necessary to extract what they desire. Surrendering our defenses to appease a civilized ideal only invites endless tragedy and victimhood. Even the greatest champions of peace understood that non-violence, to be effective, had to be wielded as a highly strategic and carefully orchestrated weapon against a cunning occupier. The inexorable logic of life dictates that whatever you deeply desire, you must be prepared to fight for it. Furthermore, the notion that strategy is an elitist, patriarchal pursuit designed solely to maintain the power of the few is a profound misconception. Historically, the elite deliberately hoarded strategic knowledge, keeping the lower ranks and the marginalized ignorant to prevent rebellion. Strategy is simply the practical art of manifesting ideas into reality and securing tangible results. It is a universal tool that should be mastered by anyone seeking to carve out their own destiny, free from the manipulation of others. In the mythos of antiquity, it was often the female deities who represented the highest virtues of strategic, intelligent warfare, standing in stark contrast to the mindless, bludgeoning violence of their male counterparts. To transform yourself into this modern strategic warrior, you must cultivate several profound internal disciplines. Foremost among these is the ability to perceive reality unclouded by the distorting lens of emotion. Emotional responses are the greatest disease of the strategic mind. Fear causes you to overestimate obstacles and retreat into a defensive shell. Anger and impatience lure you into rash, irreversible blunders. Even the intoxicating rush of success can breed a deadly overconfidence, while affection can easily blind you to the treacherous maneuvers of those standing right beside you. You cannot eradicate emotions, but you must develop the vigilant self-awareness to recognize when they are coloring your vision and immediately compensate for their pull. War demands the coldest, most uncompromising realism. Equally critical is the discipline of judging individuals solely by their observable actions. In the merciless crucible of warfare, no amount of eloquent justification can erase the reality of a battlefield defeat. Apply this same ruthless metric to the social world. Disregard the stories people tell about themselves, their stated intentions, and their moral posturing. People will say anything to secure an advantage. Look exclusively at the undeniable trail of their deeds and the concrete results they produce. Turn this same unforgiving gaze upon yourself. When you experience a setback, do not seek comfort in blaming an unfair world or a malicious rival. Assume full responsibility for your own strategic failures, dissecting your missteps so they are never repeated. In your pursuit of power and security, you must learn to depend entirely on your own internal arsenal. It is a common human frailty to seek safety in external advantages, accumulating vast wealth, leaning on powerful alliances, or utilizing the latest technological tools. Yet all material advantages are inherently fragile and can be stripped away by the unpredictable tides of fortune. The only truly unconquerable fortress is a deeply cultivated, strategically armed mind. When the inevitable crisis strikes, wealth may evaporate and allies may desert you, but a mind trained in the art of maneuver will invariably find the hidden path to victory. True power is psychological, not mechanical. As you navigate these battles, you must elevate your perspective above the chaotic, immediate clashes of the present moment. Most individuals are trapped in a tactical mindset. They are completely consumed by the immediate friction of the day, reacting frantically to every provocation in a desperate bid to win the current argument. The strategic warrior, by contrast, rises above the dust of the battlefield. You must fix your gaze firmly on the distant horizon, focusing exclusively on your ultimate, long-term objectives. When you possess this elevated vision, the petty skirmishes of daily life lose their power to agitate you. You can easily discern which minor conflicts to ignore and when a strategic retreat serves your greater campaign. While the tactical fighter is heavy and perpetually stuck in the mud, the strategist is light, mobile, and sees the entire theater of war. Finally, you must spiritualize your inner conflict. Every day brings a new struggle for survival. But the most consequential war you will ever fight is the unending campaign against your own weaknesses. You must declare absolute unyielding war on your own hesitation, your fears, and your tendency to leave tasks unfinished. Welcome adversity and friction as the ultimate testing ground. Instead of avoiding difficult situations, seek them out as the anvil upon which your warrior's spirit will be forged. It is only through constant, deliberate practice and the overcoming of internal resistance that you can build the supreme confidence required to master your environment. The knowledge required for this transformation is not a rigid doctrine or a set of mechanical formulas to be blindly memorized. Rather, it is designed to arm your mind with an expansive arsenal of options, enabling you to respond with fluid creativity to the elusive adversaries you will encounter. By studying the mechanics of self-directed warfare, the orchestration of organizational momentum, and the subtle arts of defensive, offensive, and unconventional conflict, you will bridge the perilous gap between abstract knowledge and practical execution. Strategy is not merely a subject to be studied. It is a comprehensive way of living. It requires you to translate every thought into deliberate action and to extract profound knowledge from every experience. In doing so, the inevitable battles of life cease to be sources of suffering and instead become a lifelong, deeply rewarding game of surmounting obstacles and mastering the world around you. Chapter 1. Declare war on your enemies. The polarity strategy. Human existence is an unending theater of battle and friction. It is a fundamental truth that you cannot fight effectively unless you possess the clarity to identify your adversaries. The modern world is populated by evasive individuals who mask their true intentions behind a veneer of warmth and cooperation, pretending to stand by your side while quietly advancing their own interests. To navigate this landscape, you must pierce the fog of false harmony. You must learn the subtle art of smoking out your opponents, reading the hidden signs, the micro-expressions, and the behavioral patterns that betray underlying hostility. Once these adversaries are clearly in your sights, you must inwardly declare war. Just as a magnet relies on the tension between opposing poles to generate force, your enemies, your philosophical and practical opposites, provide you with a profound sense of purpose. Those who stand in your path, who embody the traits and values you despise, are not merely obstacles. They are an extraordinary source of kinetic energy. You must shed your naivety and recognize that with certain adversaries, there is no fertile middle ground, no enduring compromise to be reached. The inner enemy. In the spring of 401 BC, a 30-year-old Athenian country gentleman named Xenophon received an unexpected invitation. A companion was actively recruiting Greek mercenaries to serve Cyrus, the ambitious brother of the Persian king Artaxerxes, and urged Xenophon to join the expedition. This was a peculiar proposition, for the Greeks and Persians harbored a long, blood-soaked history of enmity, marked by Persia's failed attempt to conquer Greece nearly a century prior. Yet the Greeks were unparalleled warriors, and the allure of foreign gold had made them willing swords for hire. Cyrus needed their martial prowess to suppress rebellious factions within his vast empire. Xenophon, having lived a sheltered life characterized by philosophical debates with Socrates and the leisurely management of his inherited estate, yearned for adventure. He joined the ranks not as a common mercenary, but as an observer and aspiring historian. A force of 10,000 battle-hardened Greeks marched deep into the heart of Persia. For months, the campaign proceeded smoothly until Cyrus finally unveiled his true, treacherous objective. He was not merely punishing rebels, he was marching on Babylon to usurp the throne from his brother. The Greek mercenaries were outraged by the deception, but Cyrus swiftly silenced their grumbling with promises of overwhelming wealth. The inevitable clash between the royal siblings occurred on the dusty plains of Cunaxa. The battle was brief and decisive, concluding with the death of Cyrus. Suddenly, the Greeks found themselves in a terrifying predicament. They were marooned in the center of a hostile empire 1,500 miles from the safety of their homeland, having fought on the losing side of a Persian civil war. Artaxerxes, the victorious king, seemingly desired no further bloodshed and dispatched his commander, Tissaphernes, to provision the Greeks and guide them out of his territory. Yet, as the arduous trek commenced, anxiety poisoned the Greek camp. Provisions were inexplicably scarce, and the chosen route seemed deliberately treacherous. Suspicions boiled over. In an attempt to clear the air, the Greek commander, Clearchus, arranged a diplomatic meeting with Tissaphernes at a neutral location. When Clearchus and his senior officers arrived, they were instantly surrounded by Persian soldiers, arrested, and promptly beheaded. When a lone survivor stumbled back to the Greek camp with news of the massacre, the atmosphere descended into absolute despair. Leaderless and surrounded by enemies, the mercenaries collapsed into drunken stupors, bitter accusations, and paralyzing fear. Xenophon, who had remained a passive observer throughout the campaign, was jolted awake that night by a vivid nightmare of a lightning bolt incinerating his father's home. The dream catalyzed a profound revelation. The Greeks were not trapped by mountains, rivers, or the Persian army. They were trapped by the creeping rot within their own minds. Operating as mere mercenaries fighting for coin, they had lost their foundational identity. They had forgotten how to distinguish between friend and foe. Xenophon realized that if they did not instantly focus their minds on the Persians' vile treachery, they would die disgracefully. They needed the polarizing clarity of absolute hatred. Summoning the surviving officers, Xenophon delivered a blistering directive. He declared that all negotiations were permanently terminated. There would be no more internal bickering or passive despair. From that second forward, every ounce of their collective energy would be weaponized against the Persians. They would burn their supply wagons, live ruthlessly off the land, and march with terrifying speed. Anyone who spoke of appeasement or compromise would be driven from the camp as a coward. They had to stop acting like confused mercenaries and remember that they were Greeks, the supreme antithesis of the treacherous Persian Empire. This absolute polarization worked a miracle. Roused by this psychological lightning bolt, the army elected new leaders, outmaneuvered the Persians, and against all odds fought their way back to the shores of Greece. Interpretation. Human existence is an unyielding struggle, a constant navigation through treacherous environments and destructive relationships. How you mentally frame these conflicts dictates your ultimate destiny. As Xenophon recognized, the true barriers to survival and success are rarely the external circumstances. They are the internal fog of confusion and passivity. If you find yourself drifting, unable to differentiate between an ally and an adversary, the fault lies entirely within your own psychological posture. You must adopt the mindset of a warrior perpetually on the edge of the battlefield. Identity is forged in the fires of opposition, just as a child defines their boundaries by pushing against the authority of their parents. A strategic mind finds its sharpest focus by clearly identifying what it is entirely against. When you lack a defined adversary, you become susceptible to other people's manipulations, hesitating at the critical moment and descending into self-pity. You must actively pinpoint an enemy. This designated opponent could be an individual who subtly thwarts your ambitions, a rival who fights without honor, or even a toxic ideology that you see taking root in your environment, be it rampant complacency, intellectual laziness, or arrogant entitlement. Ignore the soft voices of modern society that claim the rigid distinction between friend and foe is an antiquated relic. Such voices are merely projecting their own terror of conflict. By drawing a sharp, uncompromising line between yourself and your enemy, you burn away the fog. Your enemy becomes the blazing polar star that gives your actions absolute direction and unwavering force. The outer enemy, Throughout the early 1970s, the political landscape of Great Britain had decayed into a polite, predictable stalemate. Power swung gently back and forth between the Labour and Conservative parties, both of which had merged into a homogeneous, compromising centre. However, following a crushing Conservative defeat in 1974, a faction within the party sought a radical disruption and backed Margaret Thatcher for the leadership. Capitalising on internal divisions, Thatcher seized the nomination, presenting a stark anomaly in British politics. She was a woman in a fiercely patriarchal domain, a grocer's daughter leading the party of the aristocracy, and an unapologetic warrior who confronted her opponents with an aggressive, confrontational style that shocked the genteel political establishment. Initially dismissed as a temporary aberration, Thatcher used her first years as opposition leader to wage a relentless rhetorical war against the socialist system, blaming it entirely for Britain's economic decay. During the crippling public sector strikes in the winter of 1978 to 1979, she intensified her attacks, tying the chaos directly to the Labour government. Conventional political wisdom dictated that one must court the voters with soothing reassurances, yet Thatcher deliberately chose to frighten and polarize them. When the general election arrived, she framed the contest not as a standard political choice, but as an absolute crusade against the evils of socialism. Her opponent, the refined Prime Minister James Callaghan, was baited into returning her fire, warning the public that Thatcher's radicalism would shatter the economy. While this frightened some voters, Thatcher's strategy succeeded brilliantly in dividing the electorate into two distinct, warring camps. She captured the attention of the undecided masses by stepping boldly into the breach and secured a decisive victory. Once in power, advisors expected Thatcher to soften her tone and govern from the conciliatory centre. Instead, she ruthlessly escalated her policies, implementing severe budget cuts that sent the British economy into a terrifying shock, exactly as Callaghan had predicted. Unemployment skyrocketed. The moderate men within her own cabinet, whom she disdainfully labelled the Wets, panicked, fearing the destruction of their own careers. Thatcher's response to their internal dissent was a brutal, uncompromising purge. She ousted them from her inner circle, seemingly bent on isolating herself and multiplying her enemies. Her poll numbers plummeted to historic lows, and conventional observers believed her political demise was imminent. Then, in 1982, the military junta of Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, a remote British territory. The Argentine leadership calculated that Britain would not spill blood over such a barren, distant outpost. They severely misjudged Margaret Thatcher. Ignoring the frantic warnings of her own party and the fierce condemnation of the opposition, she instantly dispatched a massive naval task force across 8,000 miles of ocean. In that defining moment, the public perception of Thatcher underwent a miraculous inversion. Her irritating stubbornness was suddenly recognized as unyielding courage. Compared to the terrified, calculating men in Parliament, she stood as a paragon of absolute resolve. The British military triumphed, and Thatcher's domestic problems evaporated in the heat of her victory. She emerged as an untouchable titan, crushing all opposition in the subsequent elections. Interpretation. Margaret Thatcher understood a profound law of power. She ascended as an outsider, and her power depended on maintaining that sharp, alien edge. The fatal instinct of most individuals who achieve power is to immediately assimilate into the comfortable inner circle, shedding the very distinctiveness that propelled them upward. Had Thatcher softened into a traditional politician, she would have been swiftly discarded. Instead, she pushed her outsider status to the absolute extreme, framing herself as a lone warrior surrounded by a sea of timid, compromising men. At every critical juncture, Thatcher deliberately manufactured a fierce opponent: the socialists, the internal moderates, the Argentine junta. These adversaries were necessary tools, meticulously utilized to define her own image as resolute and unflinching. She recognized that the pursuit of universal popularity is a superficial, doomed endeavor. In the psychological battlefield of public perception, a dominating, polarizing presence wields infinitely more gravity than mere likability. By deliberately driving away those who sought compromise, she cleared the battlefield and forged a bedrock of support that would never abandon her. The gravitational pull of life constantly attempts to drag you into the soft, unremarkable center. The center is the realm of endless conciliation, where you lose your unique identity and dissolve into the collective mass. You must forcefully resist this drift, embrace the identity of the outsider, surrounded by ideological and practical enemies. This state of constant friction will keep your senses unnaturally sharp and define the boundaries of your core beliefs. Do not succumb to the desperate modern need to be liked by everyone. It is infinitely more powerful to be respected and even feared, for victory over a clear enemy grants a lasting authority that superficial charm can never achieve. Keys to warfare. We exist in a remarkably treacherous era where overt, aggressive hostility has been largely suppressed by social convention. Because direct confrontation is discouraged, the nature of human warfare has mutated, moving entirely underground. Today's battlefields are populated by slippery, evasive actors who wield false friendship, passive aggressiveness, and manufactured guilt as their primary weapons. Consequently, you must radically expand your working definition of the word enemy. It is no longer merely the person who draws a sword against you. It is anyone who subtly thwarts your progress, who offers alliances that exclusively serve their own hidden agendas, or who attempts to manipulate your emotional state to secure a tactical advantage. You must systematically observe the emotional temperature of those around you. When an associate suddenly becomes effusively complimentary or begins sharing unearned confidences, your internal alarms must sound. Such sudden shifts are rarely benign. Like Mao Zedong observing the excessively enthusiastic praise of his ambitious subordinate Lin Biao, you must recognize that heightened friendliness is often the perfect camouflage for a looming betrayal. If reading the subtle signs is insufficient, you must actively beat the grass to startle the hidden snakes. Ambiguity is your most potent tool for this extraction. Present a suspected enemy with a situation or a statement that can be interpreted in multiple ways. A true ally will overlook a slight ambiguity, but a secret enemy, projecting their own hidden malice onto your actions, will often react with sudden, irrational anger. You can also provoke a reaction by deliberately taking an extreme or slightly offensive stance in a conversation. The resulting emotional spike will cause the chameleon to drop their carefully constructed mask, revealing their genuine psychological posture. When dealing with large, abstract enemies, a sprawling bureaucracy, an entrenched corporate culture, or a complex social network, you must never attack the vague entirety of the structure. It is impossible to muster the necessary emotional intensity to fight a faceless abstraction. Instead, you must personalize the conflict. Isolate a specific leader, a vocal spokesperson, or a vital node within that network and direct all your fire at them. By forcing a direct eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation, you drag the hidden powers out of the shadows and into the harsh light of a personalized battle. Above all, you must discard the dangerous modern fallacy that conflict is a trauma to be avoided. Psychological development, from childhood through adulthood, relies entirely on the friction of opposition. It is through doing battle with our peers, our environments, and our rivals that we learn how to adapt and survive. Do not repress your anger or internalize your frustrations when faced with hostility. Externalize that energy. Turn it outward toward the adversary. An opponent provides a vital measuring stick for your own excellence. Just as a master swordsman requires a lethal rival to test his true skill, you require formidable enemies to draw out your ultimate capabilities. The tougher the opponent, the greater the internal reward. Image. The earth. Consider the ground beneath your feet. It is not an empty void. It is a force of resistance, a dense gravity that holds you in place. You must root yourself deeply into this earthly resistance to gain physical firmness and spiritual strength. Without the hard, unyielding presence of an enemy to push against, to trample upon, you lose your bearings and your sense of proportion. Authority. If you count on safety and do not think of danger, if you do not know enough to be wary when enemies arrive, this is called a sparrow nesting on a tent, a fish swimming in a cauldron. They won't last the day. Zhuge Liang, AD 181-234. Reversal. While the deliberate search for and utilization of enemies is essential for strategic clarity, it must be governed by absolute rational control. The objective is focused motivation, not descending into debilitating paranoia. Tyrants historically destroy themselves by hallucinating enemies in every shadow, exhausting their mental and physical resources in a frantic emotional frenzy. Keep your strategic suspicions entirely to yourself, so that if your internal assessments are incorrect, you expose no vulnerability. Furthermore, you must master the art of modulating your polarizing tactics. Do not back yourself into a corner from which retreat is impossible. The master strategist draws a razor-sharp line between themselves and their adversary to build intense energy, but retains the emotional discipline to instantly back away and project the illusion of the peaceful conciliator when the tactical situation demands a softer touch. Chapter 2. Do not fight the last war. The guerrilla war of the mind strategy. What most frequently anchors you to misery and stagnation is the immense weight of the past. The human mind naturally clings to unnecessary attachments, repeating tired formulas and constantly replaying the memories of previous victories and defeats. To achieve true strategic mastery, you must consciously declare war upon your own history, forcefully compelling yourself to react only to the unfolding reality of the present moment. You must be completely ruthless with yourself, refusing to deploy the same exhausted methods simply because they feel comfortable. Instead, wage a relentless guerrilla war within your own mind. Allow for no static lines of defense and no exposed citadels of dogma. Make your thoughts entirely fluid, mobile, and responsive. The Last War. No leader in history ascended to absolute power with the breathtaking speed of Napoleon Bonaparte. From a mere captain in the French Revolutionary Army in 1793, he became a brigadier general, then the conqueror of Italy, the first consul of France, and finally emperor. By 1805, he had humiliated the combined forces of the Austrian and Russian empires. For many across the continent, he was a deity of combat. Yet, among the aristocratic Prussian high command, a dangerous delusion took root. They convinced themselves that Napoleon was merely a rash opportunist who had benefited from cowardly opponents. Among these skeptics was Friedrich Ludwig, Prince of Hohenlohe-Ingelfingen. Steeped in the illustrious military traditions of Frederick the Great, Hohenlohe believed that victory was a mathematical certainty derived from strict organization, rigid discipline, and timeless strategic principles. The Prussian soldiers were drilled to function as a flawless, synchronized machine. To Hohenlohe and his aging colleagues, Napoleon was an uncultured hothead commanding a disorganized mob. They eagerly anticipated the day they would expose the Napoleonic myth and restore the traditional order of Europe. In the autumn of 1806, the Prussian king declared war, and Hohenlohe was ecstatic. He and his fellow generals spent weeks arguing over intricate plans based on the tactical maneuvers of the previous century. They were confident that their meticulously rehearsed formations would crush the French. However, days before the official declaration of war, disturbing intelligence arrived. Napoleon's forces, completely defying conventional military logic, were not dispersed as expected, but had massed deep within southern Prussia. More shockingly, the French soldiers marched without the cumbersome, slow-moving supply wagons that bogged down traditional armies. They carried their own provisions, moving with a terrifying, ghost-like speed. Before the Prussians could adjust their elegant, outdated plans, Napoleon wheeled his army north, striking directly toward the heart of Prussia. Panic gripped the Prussian command. They ordered a hasty retreat, leaving Hohenlohe to protect the rear. When the two armies finally met near the town of Jena, the numbers were roughly equal, but the mindsets were centuries apart. Hohenlohe orchestrated his troops like a magnificent ballet, with drum majors beating perfect cadences and soldiers forming immaculate lines. The French, by contrast, fought with a fluid, demonic chaos, firing from behind walls and rooftops, utilizing the terrain organically. As the Prussian lines were systematically decimated by hidden marksmen, Hohenlohe attempted to reform his ranks in the open plain, adhering to the rigid doctrines of his youth. The French simply outmaneuvered and enveloped them. In a matter of hours, the magnificent Prussian war machine shattered, and the nation fell. Interpretation. The catastrophic reality facing the Prussians was not a lack of courage or manpower. It was the fatal disease of chronological displacement. They had fallen half a century behind the times. Their elderly commanders, insulated by their previous triumphs, were merely pantomiming the formulas of a bygone era. They had observed Napoleon's innovative, highly mobile campaigns for a decade, yet they consciously chose to ignore the shifting paradigm, retreating into the comforting shell of their own historical dogma. This historical tragedy serves as a profound mirror for our own lives. The greatest limitation you will ever face is the inability to confront reality exactly as it exists right now. As we age, we inevitably become rooted in our past experiences. A tactic or behavior that once secured us a triumph solidifies into a rigid doctrine. We mistake repetition for expertise, slowly losing our creative elasticity. We rarely perceive this calcification occurring within our own minds until a modern Napoleon, a dynamic, unorthodox force, suddenly crosses our path and shatters our outdated defenses. You must never assume that the architecture of your past successes will adequately shelter you in the future. In fact, your previous victories are often your greatest strategic liabilities. Every conflict, every shifting circumstance possesses a unique geometry. You must aggressively sever your psychological ties to the past and force your eyes open to the present landscape. The persistent human tendency to fight the last war is the very mechanism that will guarantee your final defeat. The present war. In the year 1605, the legendary Japanese samurai Miyamoto Musashi, then only 21 years old, faced a lethal challenge from Mata Shichiro of the esteemed Yoshioka clan. Musashi had recently killed both Mata Shichiro's father and uncle, and the clan was thirsty for blood. Anticipating an ambush, Musashi's friends begged him not to go alone, but he refused their escort. In his previous encounters with the Yoshioka family, Musashi had employed the psychological tactic of arriving hours late to infuriate them. The clan, expecting this precise behavior, prepared their trap accordingly. Instead, Musashi arrived long before the appointed hour, hiding himself silently in the brush. When Mata Shichiro and his armed retainers arrived and lay in wait for the perpetually late swordsman, Musashi suddenly leaped from the shadows, instantly slaying the leader. Before the startled retainers could encircle him, Musashi positioned himself at an oblique angle, forcing them to attack in a broken line and systematically cut them down. His reputation secured, Musashi roamed the country, deliberately seeking out opponents who utilized unorthodox and seemingly invincible methods. He encountered a warrior named Baiken, who fought with a deadly combination of a sickle and a weighted chain. Baiken's strategy was to swing the chain to build momentum, forcing his opponent backward, then hurl the iron ball at the enemy's face before leaping in to slash the throat with the sickle. Everyone warned Musashi to walk away, as Baiken was undefeated. Yet, when the duel commenced, Musashi completely shattered Baiken's expectations. He drew two swords, a long one and a short one, a technique Baiken had never encountered. Furthermore, instead of retreating from the swinging chain, Musashi charged aggressively forward, invading Baiken's physical space. Unbalanced and unable to deploy his weapon's momentum, Baiken hesitated. In that fractured second, Musashi knocked him down with the short sword and executed him with the long one. Years later, Musashi faced his ultimate test against Sasaki Ganryu, an aristocratic master who wielded a beautiful, oversized sword. Ganryu arrived at the island jewel location with pristine punctuality. Musashi, however, reverted to his old tactic of agonizing delay. Hours passed. Finally, Musashi arrived in a small boat dressed in filthy rags, having casually carved a weapon out of a wooden oar that happened to be slightly longer than Ganryu's famous blade. Stepping onto the beach, Musashi uttered a cryptic, insulting remark that sent the haughty Ganryu into a blind, unthinking rage. Ganryu swung his magnificent sword, but blinded by his fury, he missed Musashi's skull, only slicing the dirty towel wrapped around his head. Musashi instantly brought down his heavy wooden oar, crushing his opponent. Interpretation. Miyamoto Musashi survived and triumphed not because he possessed superior physical strength or a singular, perfected technique, but because of his supreme psychological fluidity. In every single encounter, he meticulously adapted his strategy to the specific psychology of his opponent and the immediate variables of the environment. Against the Yoshioka clan, he broke his own established pattern of lateness to shatter their ambush. Against the chain-wielding Baiken, he introduced a novel two-sword technique and closed the distance, neutralizing the weapon's inherent advantage. Against the arrogant Ganryu, he utilized psychological warfare, degrading the pristine atmosphere with a carved oar and filthy rags to provoke a fatal emotional error. Musashi's adversaries all suffered from the same fatal flaw. They depended entirely on their brilliant techniques, their specialized weaponry, and the methods that had secured their previous victories. They were fighting the last war. Musashi, possessing the essence of a true strategist, transformed their rigidity into their executioner. He anchored his mind absolutely in the present moment, delivering the precise, unexpected stimulus that would throw each specific opponent off balance and then ruthlessly exploiting the resulting disequilibrium. To prepare your mind for the conflicts of life, you must purge it of all romantic myths and mechanical formulas. Strategy is not a culinary recipe to be blindly followed. Victory contains no magical, replicable sequence. Concepts and historical examples should merely serve as nutrients in the soil of your mind. expanding your sense of what is possible so that, in the chaotic heat of the moment, you can improvise an entirely original response. Release your desperate grip on rigid techniques and learn the terrifying freedom of the present moment. Keys to warfare. When we experience a failure or a bitter setback, our immediate reflex is to dissect the past, obsessing over what we should have said or done differently. We convince ourselves that our defeat was simply a matter of insufficient knowledge or inadequate planning. This is a profound misdiagnosis. Our failures rarely stem from a lack of information. They arise because our minds are completely out of tune with the present environment. We stumble because we are listening to the echoes of our own preconceived notions, blindly applying theories that have absolutely no relevance to the fluid, chaotic predicament standing right in front of us. The most brilliant strategic minds do not possess a larger database of facts than the rest of us. Rather, they possess the rare ability to instantly abandon their cherished assumptions and focus with laser-like intensity on the immediate circumstances. They understand that reality is governed by friction, the inevitable violent collision between our elegant plans and the unpredictable chaos of the real world. Since this friction cannot be eliminated, the mind must be trained to match its chaotic rhythm. The more you rely on pre-digested theories, the more disconnected and delusional your responses become. Imagine your mind as a rushing river. When it flows with violent speed, it effortlessly contours to the landscape, sweeping past obstacles and constantly refreshing its own kinetic energy. Obsessional thoughts, past traumas, and rigid doctrines act as massive boulders dropped into this river. They dam the current, forcing the water to stagnate and pool. You must wage a constant, aggressive war against this natural tendency toward mental stagnation. The first step in this internal conflict is simply recognizing the boulders. The second step is to adopt specific psychological maneuvers designed to restore the violent flow of your mind. First, you must systematically re-examine all of your most cherished beliefs and foundational principles. When asked about his principles of war, Napoleon famously declared that he had none. His genius was supreme opportunism. If you believe that strategy is governed by inexorable laws, you have already built a static fortress that your enemies will eventually bypass or destroy. You must be brutal with your own traditions. If a method has worked for you repeatedly, view it with intense suspicion. Second, you must actively erase the memory of your last war, especially if you were victorious. Success is a dangerous narcotic. It breeds profound laziness and a fatal desire to repeat the exact same maneuvers. The great North Vietnamese strategist Vo Nguyen Giap utilized a profound mental trick. After every successful campaign, he deliberately convinced himself that the effort had actually been a massive failure. By denying himself the intoxicating warmth of victory, he forced his mind back to a state of hungry, anxious creativity. Third, you must keep your mind in perpetual motion. Children learn with astonishing speed because their minds never stop to defend a particular ideology. They simply absorb the shifting world around them with restless curiosity. Superior strategists retain this childlike mobility. Whenever you catch your thoughts circling a singular obsession or a lingering resentment, you must forcefully distract yourself. Push your attention onto a new problem. A stationary target is easily destroyed. A mind in constant motion cannot be hit. Fourth, you must absorb the underlying spirit of the times. Throughout history, the most devastating mismatches occur when an army clinging to the doctrines of the past encounters an opponent who has harnessed the energy of a new technological or social paradigm. You must develop sensitive antennae for the subtle shifts in your environment. Do not become sentimentally attached to the aesthetic or the methods of your youth. The ability to completely alter your style is the ultimate defense against obsolescence. Fifth, occasionally you must reverse your course entirely. The Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky, seeking to break the stifling numbness of his daily routines, would occasionally gamble away everything he owned. By plunging himself into sudden, self-inflicted chaos, he burned away his comforting habits and forced his creative mind to engage with raw, terrifying reality. While you need not invite financial ruin, you must periodically shatter your own behavioral patterns. Do the exact opposite of what you would normally do. The resulting shock will snap your mind back to life. Ultimately, you must conceptualize your mind as a guerrilla force operating in hostile territory. A guerrilla army never establishes a static front line. It never attempts to defend a specific town or rely on slow, predictable supply chains. It survives and conquers through pure, unadulterated mobility. It attacks from unexpected angles, adapts instantly to the terrain, and melts away before the enemy can coordinate a response. Apply this exact architecture to your thinking. Refuse to defend static ideas. Exploit the chaos of your environment rather than desperately trying to force order upon it. Image water. Observe how it adapts its shape entirely to the contours of the stream. It pushes smaller rocks out of its path and patiently smooths the jagged edges of massive boulders. It never stops, never rests, and never assumes the exact same form twice. The faster it moves, the clearer and more powerful it becomes. Authority. Some of our generals failed because they worked out everything by rule. They knew what Frederick did at one place and Napoleon at another. They were always thinking about what Napoleon would do. I don't underrate the value of military knowledge, but if men make war in slavish observance to rules, they will fail. War is progressive. Ulysses S. Grant, 1822 to 1885. Reversal. While it is an absolute necessity to eradicate your own tendency to fight the last war, you must simultaneously operate under the assumption that your enemy is trying to do the exact same thing. Do not assume that because you defeated them once using a specific method, they will blindly fall for it again. Some of the most catastrophic military disasters occur when a victor assumes the defeated foe is too traumatized to adapt. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, he gambled that the United States was still paralyzed by the trauma of the Vietnam War and would refuse to engage in a massive ground conflict. He failed to realize that the American military had evolved and was fully prepared for a radically new paradigm of warfare. Never allow your enemy to surprise you with their capacity for evolution. Err on the side of caution, assuming they have learned from their failures, and always be prepared for a completely new theater of war. Chapter 3. Amidst the turmoil of events, do not lose your presence of mind, the counterbalance strategy. In the chaotic crucible of conflict, the human mind possesses a dangerous vulnerability. It naturally tends to lose its equilibrium. When faced with a sudden barrage of unexpected setbacks, relentless threats, and the paralyzing doubts of supposed allies, the immediate reflex is to yield to emotion. Fear, frustration, and a profound sense of isolation threaten to pull you off your strategic center. Surviving these tempests requires the deliberate cultivation of presence of mind, an ironclad mental balance that sustains your intellectual powers regardless of the surrounding turmoil. This is not a passive state of calm, but an active, aggressive resistance to the emotional, gravitational pull of the moment. You must learn to toughen your psyche through deliberate exposure to adversity, forging the capacity to completely detach yourself from the frantic noise of the battlefield. When those around you succumb to panic, your unwavering presence of mind will serve as the ultimate compass, steering you clear of their infectious anxieties and keeping your campaign firmly on course. The hyper-aggressive tactic. Vice Admiral Lord Horatio Nelson was a warrior intimately acquainted with the visceral horrors of combat. He had sacrificed his right eye in the siege of Calvi and his right arm at the Battle of Tenerife. He had crushed the Spanish fleet at Cape St. Vincent and dismantled Napoleon's Egyptian ambitions at the Battle of the Nile. Yet the supreme test of his psychological endurance arrived in 1801. Not from the cannons of the enemy, but from the paralyzing caution of his own commanders. England was preparing a preemptive naval strike against Denmark to shatter a coalition threatening British shipping. Nelson, the nation's most brilliant and audacious naval architect, was the logical commander for the expedition. However, the British Admiralty, fearful of Nelson's fiery temperament and deep-seated hatred of Napoleon, opted instead for Sir Hyde Parker, a man celebrated for his methodical, even-tempered approach. Nelson was relegated to second in command. Parker's guiding philosophy was everything in good order, an attitude that instantly clashed with Nelson's agonizing awareness that the Danes were using every passing day to violently fortify their harbors. Nelson meticulously studied the charts and drafted a bold, immediate plan of attack, but his urgent pleas were repeatedly dismissed by Parker's leisurely pace. When the fleet finally sailed and anchored north of Copenhagen, Parker convened a council of war. He recited a litany of terrifying intelligence. The harbor bristled with anchored warships, massive forts guarded the flanks, and mobile artillery units were primed to devastate the British ships. Furthermore, the local pilots warned of treacherous sandbars and unpredictable winds. Parker suggested the fleet wait in the open sea, hoping the Danes would eventually venture out. Nelson, his missing arm twitching with suppressed rage, paced the room. He delivered a blistering rebuke to the council. War, he declared, is never won by waiting. He dismissed the daunting Danish defenses as terrors meant only for children. He had mapped the currents, he understood the sandbars, and he proposed an immediate, unconventional assault from the south. His overwhelming, hyper-aggressive confidence electrified the room, finally compelling a reluctant Parker to approve the maneuver. The next morning, Nelson led the charge. The engagement was exceptionally brutal. The Danish guns unleashed hell upon the British line, shattering masts and tearing through hulls. Yet, amidst the slaughter, Nelson stalked the deck of his flagship, the Elephant, in a state of supreme, almost ecstatic clarity. He remarked to a shaken officer that while any second could be their last, he would not trade his position for a king's ransom. Miles away, observing from a safe distance, Parker's nerve broke. Seeing the ferocious exchange of fire and fearing the total destruction of his fleet and his career, he ordered the signal flag hoisted for a general retreat. The order was absolute. A lieutenant informed Nelson of the signal. Nelson ignored it. He demanded to know if his own signal, number 16, meaning engage the enemy more closely, was still flying. Assured that it was, he turned to his flag captain, raised his telescope to his blind eye, and calmly stated that he simply could not see Parker's signal to withdraw. His captains, forced to choose between the frantic caution of their superior and the unyielding resolve of Nelson, followed Nelson into the abyss. Within the hour, the Danish lines shattered, their guns fell silent, and victory was secured. Interpretation. The British Admiralty's reliance on Sir Hyde Parker represents a classic failure of psychological assessment. Society frequently mistakes methodical carefulness for strength. In times of peace, men like Parker project a comforting aura of stability. However, this meticulous nature is often a sophisticated mask for a profound terror of making mistakes. When thrust into the chaotic reality of battle, this hidden anxiety violently surfaces. They become paralyzed by the multitude of variables, hallucinating insurmountable problems in every minor setback. Their hesitation is not born of strategic patience, but of debilitating fear. Nelson operated on an entirely different psychic frequency. Physically frail and battered, he compensated with an internal furnace of unyielding resolve. When the engagement commenced, he deliberately amplified his aggressive impulses. He banished caution, not out of foolishness, but as a calculated psychological counterbalance. Presence of mind is the ultimate antidote to the natural human tendency to shrink under pressure. Our greatest vulnerability in conflict is the sudden erosion of our confidence, the creeping whisper that urges unnecessary caution. When the battlefield erupts, retreating into careful analysis is a fatal illusion. It is merely an excuse to avoid decisive action. In these critical junctures, you must artificially manufacture a hyper-aggressive energy to overpower your own inertia. The careful planning must be done before the first shot is fired, but once engaged, you must empty your mind of all doubt. Momentum, fueled by an almost irrational joy in the attack, will carry you through the friction that destroys the cautious mind. The detached Buddha tactic. The atmosphere on a typical film set is a cauldron of frantic energy, characterized by screaming directors, temperamental actors, and continuous crises. Yet, observing the legendary director Alfred Hitchcock at work was a profoundly disorienting experience. While the crew rushed about in a state of high anxiety, Hitchcock would invariably be found sitting in his director's chair, his eyes half closed, appearing entirely bored or completely asleep. When an actor threw a tantrum or a set piece collapsed, Hitchcock would merely sigh, adjust his posture, and ignore the hysteria. The actress, Margaret Lockwood, likened him to a nodding Buddha, presiding over the chaos with an enigmatic smile. Many observers attributed this bizarre behavior to an inherently cold, apathetic personality, or dismissed it as a theatrical gimmick. The truth was far more profound. Hitchcock's Buddha-like serenity was the result of a fanatical, almost obsessive system of pre-production. Before a single camera rolled, Hitchcock had already shot, edited, and scored the entire film within the theater of his own mind. His process began with a writer, but this was not a collaborative partnership. The writer's sole function was to transcribe the vivid, detailed dreams playing in Hitchcock's head. He dictated the exact emotional tenor of every scene, leaving no room for creative deviation. This script was then translated into a hyper-detailed shooting schedule. Every camera angle, every shadow, every prop was mapped out with architectural precision. He dictated the precise shade of green for a leading lady's dress, understanding exactly how it would read on film. When an actress complained that a grey suit washed out her complexion, Hitchcock gently informed her that she was not dressing for her complexion. She was dressing to look like a woman of mystery who had just stepped out of the San Francisco fog. The actress wore the suit. Because the architecture of the film was so perfectly rigid, the actors found a strange liberation on his sets. They did not have to carry the emotional weight of the picture. They merely had to execute his precise physical instructions. Hitchcock did not need to scream or cajole because he had systematically engineered every possible variable out of existence before the battle even began. Interpretation. Hitchcock's legendary career was born from the trauma of his very first film, a chaotic disaster that offended his deep-seated need for order. Recognizing that losing control of a set meant losing his artistic vision, he militarized his filmmaking process. He mastered every technical discipline, lighting, sound, set design, so that no subordinate could ever deceive him or claim a task was impossible. He erected an impenetrable fortress between the planning phase and the execution phase. This total preemptive control is the zenith of presence of mind. It allows you to enter the chaotic arena of execution with a mind entirely unburdened by anxiety. Setbacks will inevitably occur, but because you have exhaustively mapped the terrain and anticipated every permutation, you have contingency plans waiting in reserve. When subordinates assault you with frantic questions and panicked ideas, you can afford to offer a detached, knowing smile. You have already outthought them. The modern battlefield is saturated with competing voices, endless data, and frantic demands for your attention. It is incredibly easy to lose sight of the horizon and become trapped in the suffocating weeds of daily crises. Presence of mind is the cultivated ability to detach yourself from this immediate noise and view the entire theater of operations from a commanding altitude. This godlike distance is purchased entirely through grueling, microscopic preparation. Cultivate an aura of absolute detachment. Let your rivals wonder what hidden reserves of power allow you to remain so unnervingly calm. Keys to warfare. Humans cling desperately to the flattering illusion that we are fundamentally rational creatures. We construct neat, orderly routines that maintain a facade of logical control over our lives. However, the instant we are subjected to severe pressure or unexpected hostility, this fragile rationality shatters. We are exposed as deeply emotional animals. Under attack, our behavior is dictated by fear, rage, and a crushing sense of betrayal. The mind is inherently weaker than the emotions, but this terrifying reality only becomes apparent in the crucible of conflict, precisely when rational thought is most critical. More information or raw intellect will not save you in these moments. The only defense is a rigorously cultivated psychological toughness. This is not an innate gift. It is a muscular discipline developed exclusively through deliberate practice, repeated trials, and a willingness to endure psychological discomfort. You must actively engineer counterbalances to your own emotional gravity. The first essential exercise is to aggressively seek out conflict. General George S. Patton, burdened by a legacy of military ancestors, harbored a secret, paralyzing fear that he would act the coward under fire. During a vicious engagement in World War I, pinned down by German machine guns, his worst nightmare materialized. His legs gave way, and he lost his nerve. In that agonizing moment, he visualized his heroic ancestors staring down at him in judgment. This profound sense of honor jolted him out of his paralysis. He rose, rallied his men, and charged the guns. From that day forward, Patton actively hunted for danger, deliberately visiting the most exposed front lines to repeatedly test his resolve. Fear thrives in the darkness of the unknown and the abstract. By deliberately immersing yourself in high-stakes, uncomfortable situations, you strip fear of its mystique. You familiarize yourself with the physical sensation of dread, and through repeated exposure, you diminish its power. Furthermore, recognizing that you represent a standard, a family, or a team creates a vital sense of honor that can pull you through moments of weakness. The second discipline is the cultivation of absolute self-reliance. Dependency is the breeding ground of debilitating emotions like disappointment and frustration. Early in the American Civil War, Ulysses S. Grant found his mental balance eroding because he relied on subordinates who provided faulty intelligence or ignored his directives. The loss of external control led to an internal collapse. He recognized the danger and radically shifted his approach. He wrote the lines himself, bypassed his doubting generals, and took direct ownership of the intelligence and execution. You must expand your arsenal of skills to minimize your reliance on so-called experts. Trust your own judgment implicitly. When you depend entirely on your own eyes and your own mind, the agonizing emotions associated with reliance simply evaporate. Third, you must learn the excruciating art of suffering fools gladly. The Duke of Marlborough commanded an unwieldy alliance of European armies against the French. His fellow generals were unimaginative, overly cautious, and intensely selfish. If Marlborough had allowed their timidity to genuinely anger him, he would have lost the emotional equilibrium necessary to command the entire theatre of war. Instead, he treated his allies like irritable children. He feigned interest in their petty concerns, occasionally through the meaningless concessions, and completely detached himself emotionally from their incompetence. Exhaustion and rage are the enemies of strategy. The world is heavily populated by short-sighted, reactive individuals. Fighting them head-on is a waste of vital energy. Smile inwardly at their limitations, indulge their harmless vanities, and keep your mind utterly focused on the distant objective. Fourth, you must master the art of controlling your imagination through hyper-focused action. A peaceful Japanese tea master, visiting an unfamiliar city, was suddenly challenged to a duel by an aggressive samurai. Knowing nothing of swordsmanship, the tea master visited a local dojo simply to learn how to die with dignity. The fencing master asked him to first perform the tea ceremony. As the master executed the intricate, familiar steps, his mind cleared, and a profound, impenetrable calm settled over him. The fencing master declared that he needed no further training. If he simply approached the duel with the exact same mental state as serving tea, he would be invincible. The samurai, confronting this unnervingly serene tea master the next day, assumed he was facing a lethal, highly disciplined killer, and immediately begged for forgiveness. When fear strikes, the imagination runs wild, projecting infinite disaster. You must forcefully arrest this mental spiraling by anchoring your attention to a simple, repetitive task or a familiar ritual. This focuses the mind, expels the chaotic anxiety, and restores your center of gravity. Fifth, you must actively dismantle the aura of intimidation. The composer Dmitri Shostakovich was once summoned to a terrifying meeting with the brutal dictator Joseph Stalin. Stalin began aggressively interrogating the composer, attempting to corner him and elicit a display of fear, the exact emotion the tyrant fed upon. Shostakovich refused the bait. Instead of cowering, he calmly and rationally shifted the topic to the technical mechanics of orchestration, appealing to Stalin's vanity. He maintained his presence of mind by mentally stripping away Stalin's terrifying mythology, looking at him not as an omnipotent dictator, but as a flawed, insecure, physically unimposing man. Intimidation relies on your willingness to believe the opponent's projected myth. You must mentally shrink your adversaries, see their bluster as a symptom of their own profound insecurities. Looking at them through this clinical, unromantic lens neutralizes their power to unbalance you. Finally, you must develop an intuitive speed, the Fingerspitzengefühl, or fingertip feel, famously possessed by General Erwin Rommel. Rommel could anticipate an Allied offensive and read an opponent's psychology before the battle even commenced. This was not magic. It was the result of a ferocious dedication to knowledge. He immersed himself in the granular details of tank technology, memorized the topography of the desert, and lived among his troops to understand their exact morale. By absorbing the totality of the environment, he bypassed the slow, conscious reasoning process during battle, responding instead with devastating, unconscious intuition. To achieve this, you must know your industry, your opponents, and your tools so intimately that they become extensions of your own nervous system. Presence of mind is not a switch to be flipped only in times of crisis. It must become the permanent baseline of your daily existence. By practicing these disciplines in the mundane conflicts of peacetime, your warrior's mind will be fully primed, cold, and calculated the moment the true storm hits. Image the wind. The rush of unexpected events and the doubts and criticisms of those around you are like a fierce wind at sea. It can come from any point of the compass, and there is no place to go to escape from it, no way to predict when and in what direction it will strike. To change direction with each gust of wind will only throw you out to sea. Good pilots do not waste time worrying about what they cannot control. They concentrate on themselves, the skill and steadiness of their hand, the course they have plotted, and their determination to reach port, come what may. Authority. A great part of courage is the courage of having done the thing before. Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803 to 1882. Reversal. While maintaining equilibrium is the highest ideal, never experiencing a loss of presence of mind is a hidden vulnerability. Those who have never been genuinely unhinged are living on borrowed time. When the inevitable surprise attack comes, the psychological fall will be catastrophic. The greatest strategists use their moments of panic as a ruthless diagnostic tool, analyzing exactly what triggered the failure and forging new armor for the future. Conversely, your supreme objective on the battlefield is to deliberately engineer the loss of your enemy's presence of mind. Strike them with the unexpected, force them to make critical decisions before they are prepared, identify their emotional triggers and flood their system with them. The more chaotic and emotional you can render your opponent, the more completely you guarantee their destruction. Chapter 4. Create a sense of urgency and desperation. The death ground strategy. You are the architect of your own stagnation. The greatest peril you face does not originate from the adversaries who oppose you, but from the comforting, lethargic illusions that dwell within your own mind. The human animal is chronically prone to wasting the precious, irreplaceable currency of time by dreaming of a distant, perfected future, rather than engaging ferociously with the imperfect present. Because the immediate consequences of hesitation are rarely fatal, our daily efforts remain tepid and half-hearted. We drift through our battles. True transformation cannot be achieved through gentle contemplation or vague desires for improvement. It requires the ruthless application of absolute necessity. You must deliberately maneuver yourself into circumstances where the stakes are unimaginably high, where the luxury of wasted time and squandered resources is entirely eradicated. When the cost of losing is complete ruin, the mind miraculously discovers the power it needs to win. You must sever the psychological lifelines that tether you to the comforts of your past and plunge yourself into uncharted, hostile territories where your survival depends exclusively on your own creative ferocity. You must willingly back yourself against the wall, placing yourself on what ancient tacticians called the death ground, where the only possible escape is to fight with the unyielding desperation of the condemned. To understand the mechanics of the no-return tactic, we must look to the shores of Mexico in the spring of 1519. A young and deeply ambitious Spanish adventurer named Hernán Cortés landed with a meager force of 500 men. His objective was nothing less than the total conquest of the magnificent, gold-rich Aztec Empire, whose capital, Tenochtitlan, was guarded by hundreds of thousands of fearsome warriors. From the very beginning, however, Cortés faced a threat far more insidious than the Aztec military. Within his own ranks was a vocal faction loyal to the governor of Cuba, a man who had sent Cortés on a mere scouting mission and who coveted the glory of the conquest for himself. These loyalists grumbled endlessly, conspiring to undermine Cortés, questioning his sanity and constantly pointing to the ships anchored in the harbor as their salvation. The ships represented a return to Cuba, a return to their farms, their families, and the peaceful, risk-free lives they had left behind. They argued that remaining in this terrifying land to fight 500,000 bloodthirsty warriors was an act of pure madness. The mood of the camp steadily deteriorated. When Cortés uncovered a plot by these men to steal a ship and flee back to Cuba in the dead of night, he recognized that he was facing the absolute crisis of his campaign. He could execute the ringleaders, but the underlying rot would remain. His army was hopelessly divided in its mind. As long as the ships bobbed safely in the harbor, the men possessed a crutch. They harbored an escape route in the back of their minds. How could they possibly muster the terrifying energy required to conquer an empire when they knew they could simply sail away the moment the battle turned bloody? Cortés realized that subtlety was useless. He ordered his trusted pilots to secretly bore holes in the hulls of the ships, and then announced to the army that a sudden plague of wood-eating worms had rendered the vessels unseaworthy. One by one, the magnificent ships sank into the bay. When the final ship was run aground, the horrifying reality of the situation washed over the soldiers. They were marooned on the edge of a hostile, alien continent, surrounded by enemies with absolutely no avenue of retreat. Mutiny rippled through the ranks, but Cortés addressed them with terrifying clarity. He admitted that he had destroyed the fleet. He told them they could hang him if they wished, but that would only guarantee their swift slaughter at the hands of the indigenous tribes. The ships were gone. Cuba was gone. Their past was gone. The only way they would ever leave Mexico alive was by marching inland, destroying the Aztec Empire, and seizing its capital. By entirely eliminating their safety net, Cortés instantly transformed a divided, wavering band of mercenaries into a unified, terrifyingly desperate fighting force. Stripped of their alternatives, they marched on Tenochtitlan and achieved one of the most astonishing, brutal conquests in the history of human conflict. The root of Cortés's problem is the exact same problem that plagues your own ambitions. It is not the external obstacles that hold you back, it is your divided mind and the ships you leave anchored in your own psychological harbor. In the back of your consciousness, you maintain escape routes. A wealthy relative who can bail you out, a mediocre job you can always return to, or the illusion that you have endless years ahead of you to eventually get serious. You view these safety nets as blessings, but they are in fact a terrible curse. Because you believe you have options, you never commit yourself deeply enough to any single endeavor to achieve true mastery. You dabble, you hesitate, and you retreat at the first sign of genuine friction. To forge a conquering spirit, you must identify your crutches and systematically destroy them. You must run your ships aground. When you leave yourself with only one option, to succeed or to perish, your entire nervous system will synchronize with your ambition, generating a terrifying, unstoppable momentum. This principle extends to the deepest existential dread of all, the fear of our own mortality, and how the death at your heels tactic can violently awaken a slumbering mind. In the winter of 1849, the 28-year-old Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky was languishing in a freezing St. Petersburg prison. He had achieved early literary fame, but had drifted into a state of profound apathy, squandering his time in political salons and revolutionary discussions that yielded nothing. Arrested for his association with a radical group, he and his companions were suddenly awakened one morning, thrown into carriages, and taken to a public square. A priest stood before them, a firing squad raised its rifles, and their death sentences were read aloud. As Dostoevsky stared at the golden spire of a nearby church, watching the sunlight fade behind a cloud, the visceral reality of his own absolute end shattered him. In that fractured second, he realized the agonizing weight of all the time he had wasted. He promised himself that if he miraculously survived, he would never squander another breath. At the absolute last moment, a messenger galloped into the square with a pardon from the Tsar. The execution was a theatrical psychological torture designed to break them. Dostoevsky's sentence was commuted to 4 years of hard labor in the frozen hell of Siberia. Yet, rather than being destroyed by the trauma and the ensuing brutality of the prison camps, Dostoevsky was resurrected. The mock execution permanently altered his psychic architecture. He had felt the cold breath of death on his neck, and it cured him of his apathy forever. For the rest of his life, he wrote with a frantic, magnificent intensity, churning out masterpieces as if each day were his absolute last. We expend enormous amounts of societal and psychological energy attempting to deny the reality of death. We push it to the periphery of our vision, living under the fatal illusion that our time is limitless. This denial strips our daily actions of their weight and seriousness. As a strategic warrior, you must reverse this paradigm. You must embrace the terrifying reality that your days are strictly numbered. Do not wait for a tyrant to stage your execution. Drag the awareness of your mortality into the present moment. Let it press against your back. When you feel death at your heels, every decision becomes sharp, every action is executed with total commitment, and the petty anxieties of daily life evaporate. You recognize that you have no time for timidity or hesitation. The ancient Chinese strategist Sun Tzu codified this psychological phenomenon millennia ago. He recognized that listening to rousing speeches could never permanently alter a soldier's spirit. True motivation requires necessity. He advised commanders to deliberately march their troops into what he called death ground, a geographical position backed against a mountain, a river, or an impenetrable forest, offering zero possibility of retreat. When an army understands that it cannot flee, it fights with the ferocity of a cornered beast. The soldiers cease to be individuals worrying about their own skins. They become a unified instrument of destruction. This death ground is a psychological state as much as a physical one, and you must master the art of periodically forcing yourself onto it to combat the natural drift toward complacency. There are precise mechanisms to engineer this state of extreme necessity in your own life. First, you must occasionally stake everything on a single definitive throw of the dice. When the young Lyndon B. Johnson sought a congressional seat in Texas, he bypassed the traditional, agonizingly slow political ladder. He threw himself into a race against entrenched, heavily favored opponents in a district where he was entirely unknown. He risked complete public humiliation and the total derailment of his political future. Because he could not afford to lose, he campaigned with a manic, obsessive energy that physically hospitalized him, yet secured him a miraculous victory. Diffusing your efforts across multiple safe minor projects guarantees mediocrity. Concentrating your entire existence on one terrifying, monumental challenge forces your mind to rise to the occasion. Second, you must train yourself to act before you are completely ready. The human instinct is to delay, to gather more information, to wait for the perfect alignment of stars. In 49 BC, Julius Caesar stood at the banks of the Rubicon River with a mere fraction of his army. The Roman Senate had ordered him to disband his forces. Waiting for his remaining legions would give his enemies the time to organize his destruction. Rejecting caution, he uttered, "Let the die be cast," and plunged across the river into Italy. By forcing the issue and acting prematurely, he threw his enemies into total panic and committed himself to a path where sheer tactical brilliance was his only salvation. Cross your own Rubicons. Commit to actions that demand you figure out the solution while you are already in freefall. Third, deliberately leave comfortable situations and enter hostile, unknown waters. When the actress Joan Crawford realized her home studio, MGM, was slowly suffocating her career by casting her in safe, repetitive roles, she requested an early release from her contract, an action considered professional suicide in the golden age of Hollywood. She signed with a rival studio, rejected their mediocre scripts, and fought ruthlessly for the defining role in Mildred Pierce. By abandoning her sanctuary and stepping into the void, she forced herself to reinvent her craft, ultimately winning an Academy Award and securing her legacy. Stagnation thrives in familiarity. Rebirth requires the terrifying stimulus of the unknown. Fourth, manufacture a deep sense of you against the world. The legendary baseball hitter Ted Williams discovered that he performed at his absolute peak only when he was seething with anger. To cultivate this necessary friction, he deliberately alienated the sports press, baiting them into writing scathing, hypercritical articles about him. The resulting hostility from the media and the fans provided him with a constant, oppressive pressure. He stepped up to the plate not just to hit a ball, but to punish his detractors and violently prove them wrong. Do not seek the warm, suffocating blanket of universal approval. Embrace the animosity of your critics. Use their doubt and their hatred as high-octane fuel for your own aggressive momentum. Finally, you must maintain a relentless, almost painful state of restlessness. Napoleon Bonaparte remains the supreme exemplar of this trait. After achieving a magnificent victory in Italy, he did not pause to bask in the glory. He immediately launched an arduous campaign in Egypt. Upon his return, he seized political control of France and immediately returned to the battlefield. He viewed peace and rest as merely the breeding grounds for lethargy and eventual death. He constantly sought out the next crisis, the next theater of war, demanding that his mind and body operate at the absolute limits of human endurance. You must cultivate this same dissatisfaction with your current achievements. The moment you secure a victory, the moment you feel a sense of lasting comfort, you must intentionally disrupt it. Consider the elemental nature of fire. On its own, a spark is weak and easily extinguished, but place it in the right environment. Surround it with dry timber, subject it to the violent pressure of the wind, and it feeds upon itself, accelerating into a terrifying, consuming inferno that devours everything in its path. You must provide the wind and the pressure to ignite your own internal fire. As Sun Tzu decreed, put them in a spot where they have no place to go and they will die before fleeing. If they are to die there, what can they not do? Warriors exert their full strength. When warriors are in great danger, then they have no fear. However, the master strategist understands that while placing yourself on death ground is essential for your own empowerment, you must absolutely avoid fighting any adversary who has been forced onto death ground themselves. Desperate people, stripped of all hope and having nothing left to lose, are the most dangerous creatures on earth. They will fight with a suicidal intensity that defies all rational calculation. If you encounter an enemy backed into a corner, you must deliberately leave them an avenue of escape, an illusion of hope. Let them think they have a way out, and their desperate energy will instantly dissipate. Furthermore, in your offensive maneuvers, always strive to lull your opponents into a false sense of security. Lower their sense of urgency. Convince them they have infinite time and abundant resources. When you finally strike, their minds will be soft, slow, and completely unprepared for the violence of your reality. Chapter 5. Avoid the snares of groupthink. The command and control strategy. You may possess the most brilliant strategic mind in the world, capable of conceptualizing unbeatable tactics and grand designs. Yet, if the group you lead, the very instrument you rely upon to execute your vision, is unresponsive, sluggish, or primarily motivated by individual self-interest, your towering ideas will amount to absolutely nothing. The harsh lesson of warfare is that the architectural structure of your army, specifically the chain of command and the precise relationship of the individual parts to the whole, is what actually breathes life and force into your strategies. The overarching objective in any conflict is to engineer speed and adaptable mobility deep into the skeleton of your organization. Achieving this requires a singular, unified authority at the pinnacle, actively eradicating the fatal hesitation and paralysis that always accompany divided leadership. It demands communicating a crystal-clear sense of the ultimate objective to your personnel, while simultaneously granting them the operational latitude to take independent action in the pursuit of that goal. Instead of functioning as mindless reactive automatons, they must be empowered to respond fluidly to the unpredictable friction of the battlefield. Furthermore, it necessitates the cultivation of a profound group morale, a unifying spirit that propels the collective forward with an irresistible, terrifying momentum. When your forces are structured in this dynamic manner, you gain the supreme advantage of adapting to chaotic circumstances far more rapidly than your adversary. This classical military model translates perfectly to any modern organization. The only prerequisite is that before you ever formulate a strategy or initiate action, you must ruthlessly analyze the existing structure of your group. You possess the power to dismantle and redesign this structure to serve your ultimate purposes. The broken chain. To grasp the catastrophic consequences of a flawed organizational structure, one must examine the tragedy of the British campaign at Gallipoli during the First World War. By the end of 1914, the Western Front had decayed into a horrific, immovable stalemate. Seeking a decisive alternative, the British military leadership conceptualized a bold amphibious assault on the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey. If successful, this maneuver would secure the Dardanelles, threaten the Turkish capital of Constantinople, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and open a vital supply artery to Russia. General Sir Ian Hamilton, a seasoned and intelligent commander, was selected to lead the expedition. His initial landings in April 1915, however, were plagued by inaccurate intelligence, navigational errors, and a surprisingly ferocious Turkish defense. The invasion swiftly devolved into yet another paralyzing stalemate, with the Allied forces pinned desperately to the beaches. Seeking to shatter this deadlock, Hamilton devised a brilliant new maneuver. He would orchestrate a surprise landing of 20,000 troops farther north at Suvla Bay, an undefended harbor surrounded by forgiving terrain. By seizing this location, he would force the Turks to divide their forces, thereby relieving the pressure on the southern beaches and breaking the entire campaign wide open. To execute this critical operation, however, Hamilton was saddled with Lieutenant General Sir Frederick Stopford, an elderly commander who had never led troops in actual combat, and his subordinate, Major General Frederick Hammersley, a man recovering from a recent nervous breakdown. Hamilton possessed a genteel, deferential leadership style. He believed in providing his officers with the broad objectives of a battle and trusting them to orchestrate the specific details. Therefore, when he instructed Stopford to advance rapidly upon landing and secure the towering Teke Tepe hills, the geographical key to dominating the entire peninsula, he phrased it as a polite suggestion rather than a rigid, time-sensitive directive. Hamilton wanted the hills taken as soon as possible, but Stopford, paralyzed by an inherent fear of risk, interpreted the gentlemanly order to mean he should advance only if he deemed it entirely safe. This diluted sense of urgency trickled down to Hammersley, and by the time the order reached the frontline colonels, it had lost all meaning and force. When the massive Allied force landed at Suvla Bay on the morning of August 7th, the environment was practically devoid of Turkish resistance. The path to the vital hills lay completely open, yet the officers on the beach, lacking clear directives and terrified of making a fatal error, began to argue among themselves. They dispatched frantic messengers seeking clarification. Hammersley, utterly overwhelmed, had no answers. Stopford, preferring the illusion of control, had remained comfortably offshore on a naval vessel, making him nearly impossible to reach in a timely manner. Hamilton himself was stationed on a distant island. The entire crucial first day evaporated in a fog of bureaucratic indecision and the agonizingly slow relay of messages. By the following afternoon, a deeply anxious Hamilton visited Stopford's ship, only to find his subordinate congratulating himself on a successful landing, having made absolutely no effort to advance inland. Stopford insisted on consolidating his beachhead and waiting for artillery, terrified of a phantom counterattack. Stifling his mounting rage, Hamilton personally traveled to the beach, where he discovered the army languishing in a state of relaxed inertia. He finally located Hammersley, who was obsessively supervising the construction of his own headquarters. When Hamilton demanded to know why the hills had not been secured, Hammersley blamed the cautious directives he had eventually received from the distant Stopford. Realizing that a handful of unseen snipers had paralyzed an army of 20,000 men, and knowing that massive Turkish reinforcements were rushing toward the sector, Hamilton finally abandoned his polite demeanor and ordered an immediate, desperate night march to seize the heights. It was too late. As dawn broke, Hamilton watched through his binoculars as the Allied troops were violently repulsed from the hills. The Turks had arrived a mere 30 minutes earlier. The spectacular opportunity was lost, the army was trapped on the beach, and the entire Gallipoli campaign was ultimately abandoned in failure. Interpretation. The architectural genius of Hamilton's initial plan was undeniable. He had mastered the logistical nightmare of an amphibious assault, understood the supreme value of deception, and accurately identified the geographical center of gravity that would break the enemy. Yet, he completely neglected the most vital component of his entire strategy, the chain of command. He depended entirely on this human circuit to transmit his vision, gather intelligence, and adapt to the chaotic friction of the battlefield. The primary links in his chain were men consumed by the fear of risk. Hamilton fatally failed to adjust his leadership style to compensate for their psychological weaknesses. His polite, ambiguous directives were filtered through their timidity. The frontline officers, utterly disconnected from the overarching strategy and deprived of immediate leadership, defaulted to a state of terrified paralysis. Vagueness at the very top of the structure inevitably metastasized into absolute lethargy at the bottom. The catastrophic failure at Gallipoli was not a failure of strategy or firepower. It was the direct result of a shattered chain of command. When your grand designs disintegrate and monumental opportunities slip through your fingers, the immediate human reflex is to seek external scapegoats. You blame the incompetence of your subordinates, the unreliability of your technology, or the unpredictability of the market. This reactive mindset guarantees perpetual failure. The absolute truth of leadership is that everything, without exception, radiates downward from the top. Your ultimate success or destruction is dictated entirely by your personal style of command and the specific organizational architecture you construct. If your directives are weak, ambiguous, or lacking in absolute conviction, they will become entirely meaningless by the time they reach the point of execution. If you permit individuals to operate in an unsupervised vacuum, they will inevitably revert to their baseline human nature. They will interpret your goals through the distorting lens of their own self-interest. You must meticulously calibrate your command style to the specific psychological makeup of the individuals within your group. A functional chain of command is never a happy accident. It is a deliberate, highly engineered work of art that demands relentless, microscopic attention. Remote control. To master the art of organizational control, one must study the profound methods of General George C. Marshall. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed Marshall as the Army Chief of Staff in 1939, the American military establishment was in a state of catastrophic dysfunction. The War Department was a sprawling, inefficient labyrinth choked by senior generals aggressively protecting their personal fiefdoms and utilizing outdated, archaic doctrines. Marshall recognized that the United States would inevitably be drawn into the escalating global conflict, and he was tasked with transforming this broken bureaucracy into a modern, streamlined war machine. However, he knew that attempting to micromanage this sprawling beast or engaging in endless, petty bureaucratic skirmishes with entrenched generals would only exhaust him, breed deep resentment, and blind him to the grand strategic horizon. To conquer the institution, he had to operate through a sophisticated system of remote control. During his previous tenure at the infantry school at Fort Benning, Marshall had meticulously observed and catalogued the brightest, most adaptable young officers. Upon assuming control of the War Department, he ruthlessly purged the aging, inflexible brass and strategically replaced them with these carefully vetted protégés. The most prominent among these was Dwight D. Eisenhower. Marshall brought Eisenhower into the War Plans Division and subjected him to a grueling, months-long period of intense observation. Through daily interaction, Eisenhower systematically absorbed Marshall's philosophy of leadership, his intolerance for waste, and his precise method of strategic execution. Once Marshall was absolutely certain that Eisenhower internalized his vision, he elevated him to supreme command in Europe, trusting him implicitly. He then advised Eisenhower to replicate this exact system, suggesting he cultivate his own highly attuned deputy to act as an operational filter. Marshall duplicated this cloning process throughout the entire command structure. He enacted a brutal streamlining of the bureaucracy, reducing the number of officers reporting directly to him from 60 down to a mere 6. He despised bureaucratic bloat and demanded that complex strategic assessments be distilled into concise, actionable summaries. If an officer submitted a report that was a single page too long, or verbally rambled during a briefing, Marshall would simply avert his gaze, projecting a terrifying aura of bored disappointment. Without raising his voice or uttering a single reprimand, he conditioned his staff to operate with ruthless efficiency. His 6 direct deputies completely adopted his mindset, and they, in turn, relentlessly enforced this high-velocity standard upon their own subordinates. The speed and clarity of communication throughout the entire military apparatus increased exponentially. Marshall's power was absolute, yet it remained largely invisible. The thousands of individuals operating within his massive system rarely interacted with him directly, but his presence permeated every decision. They felt his influence in the rapid execution of orders, the elimination of institutional friction, and the unified, aggressive spirit of the officers he had installed. He commanded a global war machine not through tyrannical dictation, but by engineering an organizational culture that effectively policed itself. Interpretation. The contemporary landscape is infinitely more complex and fractured than the environment Marshall navigated. We operate in an era characterized by a pervasive distrust of traditional authority. Every individual within an organization fancies themselves an autonomous operator, prioritizing their personal career trajectory and emotional needs above the unified objectives of the group. This modern reality seduces many leaders into adopting a dangerously permissive style. Desperate to appear democratic, inclusive, and universally liked, they subject every critical decision to group consensus. They distribute strategic planning among committees, inherently believing that a collective mind is superior to a singular vision. This is a fatal strategic illusion. By surrendering to the collective, these leaders unknowingly violate the most sacred, inviolable law of warfare, the absolute necessity of unity of command. Throughout the blood-soaked history of human conflict, divided leadership has consistently proven to be a reliable recipe for total annihilation. When the massive Roman army faced Hannibal at Cannae, their structural flaw of rotating command between 2 politically motivated consuls resulted in catastrophic indecision and the slaughter of tens of thousands. Conversely, leaders who violently defended their singular authority, from Frederick the Great to Napoleon Bonaparte, were able to execute maneuvers with a terrifying velocity that shattered their committee-led opponents. The inherent danger of the group dynamic is that it is fundamentally political. Individuals within a committee do not analyze a crisis dispassionately. They calculate their responses based on how their words will impact their status within the hierarchy. They avoid bold, necessary risks in favor of safe, watered-down compromises that offend no one but achieve nothing. The collective mind is inherently sluggish, unimaginative, and heavily prone to irrational panic. Keys to warfare. Your paramount objective as a strategic leader is to fiercely protect your unity of command. You must retain absolute control over the overarching strategic vision. This architecture must originate from your mind alone. However, you must execute this control with extreme subtlety. You must operate from behind a heavy curtain, creating the comforting illusion of participation. Solicit advice, absorb the valuable insights generated by your team, and politely deflect their useless anxieties. You may even implement minor cosmetic alterations to your plans to soothe the egos of the political animals in your ranks, making them feel instrumental to the process. But you must never, under any circumstances, allow the committee to dictate the ultimate direction of the campaign. True control is an elusive, paradoxical force. Often, the tighter you grip the reins, the more violently the organization bucks against your authority. The master strategist understands that authentic power is generated by assembling a highly calibrated team that intimately shares your core values and operational standards. You must actively seek out individuals who possess the specific technical skills and temperaments that you lack. However, you must never be blinded by a glittering resume or raw intellect. The most critical attributes are psychological: the capacity to absorb your vision, the fortitude to accept heavy responsibility, and the rare ability to think independently while remaining aligned with the ultimate objective. Once you have installed these individuals, you must grant them the operational freedom to execute. By delegating the tactical minutiae, you project an aura of confident, relaxed authority, while simultaneously preserving your mental energy for the critical analysis of the grand strategic horizon. Furthermore, an effective chain of command must function as a high-speed nervous system, transmitting unfiltered reality from the outermost edges of the battlefield directly to your mind. Relying solely on official, bureaucratic channels is incredibly dangerous. As information ascends the hierarchy, it is inevitably sanitized, summarized, and distorted by subordinates seeking to protect their own interests. To combat this institutional blindness, you must cultivate what military theorists term a directed telescope. This is an informal, highly trusted network of loyalists, allies, and observers embedded deep within the various layers of your organization. When you require instantaneous, unvarnished truth regarding a specific crisis or the actual morale of the troops, you bypass the formal chain entirely and utilize this shadow network. This provides you with the supreme flexibility to see the battlefield clearly and adapt your maneuvers before your opponent even recognizes the shifting landscape. Finally, you must be intensely vigilant regarding the formulation and delivery of your commands. Vague, hesitant orders are worse than useless. They project weakness and breed paralyzing confusion among those tasked with execution. You must achieve absolute internal clarity regarding your objectives before you ever open your mouth. Conversely, issuing overly rigid, microscopic instructions reduces your personnel to mindless drones, stripping them of the creative elasticity required to navigate unforeseen obstacles. The masterful command is a delicate balance. It articulates the precise ultimate objective and the overarching spirit of the campaign, yet provides the executor with the necessary leeway to adapt their methods to the immediate reality of the ground. When an order is inspiring and luminous with purpose, the recipient ceases to be a mere subordinate and transforms into an active, aggressive participant in a monumental crusade. Image: the reins. A horse with no bridle is useless, but equally bad is the horse whose reins you pull at every turn, in a vain effort at control. Control comes from almost letting go, holding the reins so lightly that the horse feels no tug but senses the slightest change in tension and responds as you desire. Not everyone can master such an art. Authority: better one bad general than two good ones. Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769 to 1821. Reversal: there is absolutely no strategic or organizational scenario in which divided leadership yields a positive outcome. If you are ever presented with an opportunity that requires you to share ultimate command or govern by committee, you must unequivocally reject it. Such an enterprise is fundamentally doomed to failure, and you will inevitably absorb the blame for the resulting catastrophe. It is strategically far superior to accept a subordinate position and allow the other individual to shoulder the impossible burden of divided rule. Conversely, you must always aggressively seek out and exploit the structural flaws in your enemy's command hierarchy. Never allow yourself to be intimidated by a massive coalition of forces aligned against you. If their leadership is fractured, if their decisions require consensus and endless debate, their numerical superiority is entirely irrelevant. Like Napoleon facing the sprawling, committee-led armies of Europe, you must actively hunt for adversaries crippled by divided leadership. Their structural paralysis guarantees your ultimate victory. Chapter 6. Segment your forces. The controlled chaos strategy. There is a fundamental, fatal illusion regarding power and organization. The belief that sheer size and massive centralization inevitably guarantee dominance. We naturally assume that a larger army, a more expansive corporation, or a heavily consolidated political movement will easily crush a smaller, fragmented opponent. However, the physical laws of conflict dictate the exact opposite. As an entity grows in mass, it inherently loses its mobility. It becomes a lumbering giant, crippled by its own bureaucratic weight, moving at the agonizingly slow pace of its most cautious leaders. The transmission of information becomes a nightmare by the time intelligence reaches the singular brain at the top and an order is dispatched to the extremities. The reality on the battlefield has entirely changed. In the brutal, high-velocity arenas of war and life, mass without speed is not an advantage. It is a profound vulnerability. To survive and conquer, you must engineer speed into the very DNA of your organization. This requires the terrifying act of deliberate decentralization. By By breaking your massive structure into smaller, self-sufficient, highly mobile segments, you introduce a deadly, calculated chaos into your enemy's environment. While they struggle to comprehend your shifting, amoeba-like form, your autonomous units can move with terrifying velocity, overwhelming their rigid defenses and striking from multiple angles simultaneously. The calculated chaos tactic. In the late summer of 1805, the European continent braced for a colossal collision. The Austrian Empire, allied with Russia and Britain, was determined to crush Napoleon Bonaparte once and for all. Command of the magnificent Austrian army was entrusted to General Karl Mack von Leiberich. Mack was a highly respected tactician, a man who viewed war as a supreme science governed by immutable mathematical laws. He commanded his army in the traditional aristocratic manner, a singular, massive column of soldiers, tightly controlled from the center, tethered to enormous, slow-moving supply trains. Mack meticulously analyzed the map and positioned his vast force at the fortress of Ulm in Bavaria. He calculated that Napoleon, marching from the French coast, had only one logical, geographically feasible route through the Black Forest. Mack was prepared to wait at Ulm, absorb the French assault, and crush the upstart emperor against the anvil of the Austrian defenses. Napoleon, however, possessed a mind that despised the rigidity of conventional military architecture. He recognized that commanding an army of nearly 200,000 men as a single, unified mass would result in paralyzing friction and logistical starvation. Therefore, in the weeks before the campaign, he enacted a radical, unprecedented structural revolution. He shattered the mighty Grande Armée into 7 distinct segments, which he called corps. Each corps was effectively a miniature army, ranging from 15,000 to 30,000 men. Each possessed its own dedicated infantry, cavalry, artillery, and engineering units, rendering it entirely self-sufficient on the battlefield. More importantly, each corps was commanded by a carefully selected marshal, who was granted an extraordinary degree of operational autonomy. As the French forces marched eastward toward the Danube, they did not move as a single, predictable leviathan. Instead, the 7 corps spread out across a vast 200-mile front, advancing on separate parallel routes. They moved with a terrifying, unprecedented velocity, living off the land instead of waiting for massive supply wagons. For General Mack, waiting patiently at Ulm, the incoming intelligence reports were entirely incomprehensible. His scouts brought panicked news of French cavalry spotted to the north, then infantry sighted to the south, and artillery moving through the center. The French forces seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Mack desperately tried to chart Napoleon's movements on his immaculate maps, attempting to divine the true center of the French army, the singular point of attack that traditional military doctrine promised. But there was no center. The French advance resembled a sprawling, chaotic swarm of insects. Paralyzed by this sensory overload and terrified of making a catastrophic miscalculation, Mack froze. He refused to abandon the safety of Ulm, clinging to the hope that the chaos would eventually resolve into a clear, linear battle. It was a fatal hesitation. Napoleon's separated corps, operating on a unified, overarching vision, violently converged upon the Austrian position. Without fighting a single massive, decisive battle, the French segments enveloped Ulm, severing all of Mack's escape routes and lines of communication. Surrounded by an enemy that had materialized out of thin air, Mack was forced to surrender his entire pristine army of 50,000 men. The Austrian war machine was dismantled not by superior firepower, but by the sheer, terrifying speed of calculated chaos. Interpretation. General Mack's destruction was sealed long before he ever reached the fortress of Ulm. It was preordained by the rigid, centralized architecture of his own mind. He believed that control required absolute, microscopic supervision. He expected Napoleon to play by the same classical rules, engaging in a slow, predictable chess match where mass collided evenly with mass. Napoleon fundamentally redefined the geometry of warfare. He understood that a centralized command structure creates a crippling bottleneck. When every single decision, no matter how minor, must be routed through the supreme commander, the entire army is reduced to the processing speed of one human brain. By segmenting his forces into autonomous corps, Napoleon essentially created a multi-processor war machine. The sheer volume of tactical decisions was distributed among his highly capable marshals. To the rigid mind of the enemy, this segmented structure appears as pure, terrifying anarchy. They cannot predict your movements, they cannot locate your vital organs, and they cannot anticipate the direction of your next strike. Yet, this chaos is entirely illusory. Beneath the fluid, unpredictable exterior lies a profound internal order. Because each segment shares a deep understanding of the ultimate strategic objective, they can operate independently in the immediate chaos of the present, confident that their actions are harmonizing with the broader campaign. True power in any conflict belongs not to the heaviest force, but to the most adaptable, decentralized network. Keys to warfare. The modern environment, much like the battlefields of the 19th century, is saturated with unpredictability and friction. Markets shift overnight, alliances fracture without warning, and new technologies render established methods obsolete in an instant. If you attempt to navigate this turbulent landscape with a rigid, top-down hierarchy, you will inevitably share the tragic fate of General Mack. Your organization will be too slow to capitalize on fleeting opportunities and too cumbersome to evade sudden, lethal threats. The supreme architectural challenge for any strategic leader is the implementation of what the German military would later codify as Auftragstaktik, or mission command. This philosophy dictates a radical shift in how you exercise authority. Instead of issuing granular, step-by-step instructions that turn your subordinates into unthinking automatons, you must learn to communicate only the ultimate objective. You define the what and the why with absolute clarity, but you deliberately leave the how entirely up to the individuals executing the task. This requires the subjugation of your own ego. The natural human impulse of any leader is to micromanage, driven by the vain belief that no one else can execute the task as perfectly as they can. You must aggressively suppress this instinct. Micromanagement is a poison that destroys the initiative of your personnel. It trains them to wait passively for your orders, ensuring that the moment they encounter an unexpected obstacle, they will freeze and seek your permission to proceed. You must trust the intellect and the instincts of the people you have positioned in the field. To execute the strategy of controlled chaos successfully, several foundational pillars must be meticulously constructed. First, you must cultivate a unifying philosophy, a shared institutional DNA. The individual segments of your organization cannot be permitted to pursue contradictory goals. They must be steeped in your overarching vision, understanding not just their specific task, but how their role fits into the grand tapestry of the campaign. When this shared understanding is profound, you can release the reins with confidence. Second, you must demand extreme, continuous communication between the segments. Decentralization does not mean isolation. The individual units must constantly share intelligence, resources, and tactical adjustments laterally, without waiting for the information to slowly travel up to the high command and back down again. This creates a vibrant, highly responsive network that can instantly adapt to localized friction. Third, you must foster an internal culture that celebrates calculated risk and forgives tactical failure. If your subordinates know that a mistake will result in brutal punishment or public humiliation, they will never exercise the independent initiative required for mission command. They will revert to safe, timid, defensive postures. You must accept that in a high-velocity, segmented organization, errors will occur. The strategic advantage of speed and adaptability infinitely outweighs the minor costs of these localized failures. When you successfully segment your forces, you transform your organization into a terrifying, elusive predator. Like a master martial artist who strikes simultaneously with hands, elbows, knees, and feet, your multiple autonomous units assault the enemy's senses. The adversary is forced to divide their attention and their resources, defending everywhere and therefore defending nowhere. They are overwhelmed by a relentless barrage of unpredictable maneuvers, unable to find a stable center of gravity to attack. In their desperation to impose order upon your calculated chaos, they will inevitably expose their own fatal weaknesses. Image. A swarm of wasps. It possesses no identifiable center, no single beating heart that can be pierced to end its life. If you strike at it with a club, the weapon passes harmlessly through empty air, while the swarm effortlessly divides and regroups. It surrounds its massive victim, attacking aggressively from every conceivable angle, exploiting every tiny gap in the armor until the giant collapses from 1,000 simultaneous wounds. Authority. To manage a host, one must divide it into small numbers. To control a large force is the same principle as controlling a few men. It is merely a question of dividing up their numbers. Sun Tzu, 4th century BC. Reversal. While the strategy of segmentation and decentralization is generally paramount in complex environments, there are specific critical junctures where temporary absolute centralization is not only advantageous, but necessary for survival. If your organization is comprised of inexperienced, unproven individuals who have not yet internalized your strategic vision, granting them broad autonomy is an invitation to total disaster. In such cases, you must maintain a tight, controlling grip until the necessary institutional discipline is forged. Furthermore, there are moments in any campaign when you must deliver a singular, crushing, decisive blow. When this maximum kinetic energy is required, the fluid, dispersed segments must be violently, rapidly recalled and fused back into a dense, unified spearhead. The ultimate mark of the master strategist is the profound flexibility to toggle seamlessly between these two states, dispersing the forces to confuse, paralyze, and outmaneuver the enemy, and then centralizing them instantly to deliver the final, annihilating strike. Chapter 7. Transform your war into a crusade. Morale strategies. The secret to motivating an army and maintaining its morale is to relentlessly shift the focus of your personnel away from their selfish individual needs and toward the supreme survival of the group. Left to their own devices, human beings will naturally prioritize their own comfort and safety. To overcome this paralyzing gravity, you must involve them in a sweeping cause, transforming a mundane struggle into a magnificent crusade against a deeply hated enemy. You must engineer an environment where they recognize that their personal survival and prosperity are inextricably tied to the success of the whole. In a group that has forged profound, unbreakable bonds, moods and emotions become violently contagious, making it incredibly easy to infect your troops with an unstoppable enthusiasm. You must lead from the absolute front, letting your soldiers see you bleeding in the trenches, shouldering the exact same burdens and sacrifices that you demand of them. This visceral display of shared hardship will fill them with a desperate desire to emulate your courage and earn your approval. Furthermore, you must make both your rewards and your punishments exceedingly rare but highly meaningful, keeping your followers in a constant state of psychological suspense. When Napoleon Bonaparte first assumed command of the French army of Italy in 1796, he was a relatively unknown 26-year-old general facing a monumental crisis. The army he inherited was an absolute disaster. The soldiers were starving, deeply cynical, completely unpaid, and dressed in pathetic rags. They had languished in the mountains for years, completely forgotten by the corrupt political leadership in Paris. Desertion and mutiny were daily occurrences. The generals under his command, battle-hardened veterans, viewed this newly appointed, slightly built Corsican with profound contempt. Napoleon recognized that imposing strict top-down military discipline upon such a broken force would instantly trigger a massive revolt. He needed to reach into their souls and completely rewire their psychology. When he first reviewed the troops, he did not issue threats or recite military regulations. Instead, he stepped before them and spoke with a fiery, piercing intensity. He acknowledged their misery, entirely validating their anger and frustration. Then he pointed outward, toward the lush, wealthy plains of the Piedmont region of Italy. He told them that he was about to lead them into the most fertile territory in the entire world, where they would find honor, glory, and unimaginable riches. He did not appeal to their abstract patriotism. He appealed directly to their desperate hunger, their bruised pride, and their latent, aggressive spirit. He gave their suffering a divine purpose. However, Napoleon knew that soaring rhetoric evaporates the moment the first bullets fly. To forge a genuine crusade, he had to prove that he was not merely another distant aristocrat treating them as cannon fodder. As the campaign commenced, he operated with a terrifying, restless energy. He ate the same putrid bread as his foot soldiers, slept on the frozen ground among them, and refused the luxurious quarters traditionally reserved for commanders. During the agonizing Battle of Lodi, when the French advance stalled under a withering barrage of Austrian artillery, Napoleon did the unthinkable. He dismounted, rushed to the absolute front of the line, and personally led the charge across a heavily fortified narrow wooden bridge. It was an act of almost suicidal bravery. The psychological effect on the army was miraculous. The soldiers, previously apathetic and terrified, were suddenly electrified by the sight of their commanding general risking his life in the mud and the blood right beside them. they charged behind him and shattered the Austrian defenses. In the aftermath of the battle, the troops affectionately bestowed upon him the nickname the Little Corporal. He had ceased to be an abstract authority figure. He had become their brother, their spiritual leader, their totem. Interpretation. Napoleon Bonaparte stands as arguably the greatest orchestrator of human morale in the history of conflict. He inherited a chaotic mass of unruly, undisciplined young men, freshly liberated by the chaotic terror of the French Revolution, and meticulously molded them into the most devastating fighting force the world had ever witnessed. Their fanatical devotion was all the more astonishing considering the horrific ordeals, the endless marches, and the brutal winters he subjected them to. Napoleon utilized an expansive, brilliant psychological arsenal to construct this army. He unified them around a transcendent cause, first spreading the intoxicating ideals of the revolution and later cultivating the romantic mythos of France as a glorious, invincible empire. He treated his soldiers with deep respect, but never coddled or spoiled them. He understood that human beings are ultimately driven not by their wages, but by a profound thirst for glory, recognition, and meaning. By leading from the absolute front, he proved his own bravery repeatedly, effectively shaming anyone who might consider acting the coward. He kept his forces in a state of perpetual motion, ensuring there was always a new horizon to conquer, a new crusade to wage, preventing the lethal rot of boredom from ever taking root. Of all Napoleon's psychological techniques, none was more devastatingly effective than his highly theatrical management of punishments and rewards. He did not distribute praise lightly, nor did he dole out constant reprimands. When he was genuinely angry, his rebukes were catastrophic. The targeted officer felt utterly disowned, cast out into the cold, exiled from the warmth of the general's family. Desperate to regain the emperor's favor, that officer would fight with a renewed, almost suicidal intensity. Conversely, his promotions and public honors were extraordinarily rare, and when they were bestowed, they were strictly based on battlefield merit, never on political calculation. Caught between these two immense psychological poles, the agonizing terror of displeasing Napoleon and the desperate, burning yearning for his divine recognition, his men were pulled irresistibly into his orbit. They followed him with blind devotion, constantly striving to catch up to an impossible ideal. Keys to warfare. It is a natural human instinct in the arena of war to focus almost entirely on the physical, measurable aspects of the conflict, the accumulation of equipment, the counting of manpower, the analysis of raw data and advanced technology. Because conflict is an intensely visceral and dangerous affair, it requires a supreme exertion of intellect to rise above this materialistic illusion and ask the deeper, structural questions. What unseen force actually compels an army to move? What hidden reservoir grants a group the endurance to survive endless setbacks? What is the invisible architecture that binds a collective together and gives their actions terrifying force? The answer is morale. Morale is the spiritual engine of warfare. You can possess the most sophisticated tactical plans in the world, backed by unlimited financial resources and overwhelming numerical superiority. But if the individuals required to execute your vision are apathetic, divided, or motivated solely by their weekly paycheck, your grand designs will inevitably collapse upon contact with the determined enemy. The greatest vulnerability of any organization is the inherent selfishness of the individuals within it. In times of peace and prosperity, this selfishness is easily masked by polite cooperation. But the moment friction arises, the moment danger or exhaustion enters the equation, the facade disintegrates. People retreat into defensive postures, prioritizing their own careers, their own safety, and their own immediate comfort above the overarching objectives of the campaign. Your paramount task as a strategic leader is to actively wage war against this entropic selfishness. You must pull your people out of their isolated egos and plunge them into the intoxicating waters of a shared crusade. First, you must master the art of emotional contagion. Human beings are deeply susceptible to the moods of those around them. If a leader projects anxiety, hesitation, or a lack of conviction, that poison will instantly filter down through the ranks, paralyzing the entire structure. Conversely, a leader who radiates absolute certainty, supreme confidence, and a restless desire for action will infect the group with the exact same martial energy. You cannot manufacture this energy through memos or logical arguments. It must be generated emotionally. You must learn to lower your group's defenses through shared rituals, compelling narratives, and dramatic gestures, slowly bringing them into a unified psychic frequency. Second, you must recognize the immense power of shared sacrifice. The era of the distant, comfortable commander issuing orders from a luxurious pavilion is dead. If you expect your personnel to work grueling hours, navigate immense stress, and endure profound difficulties, you must be the first one to bleed. You must make a public, visible display of your own sacrifice. When your troops see that you are willingly enduring the exact same deprivations that they are, their natural resentment toward authority evaporates. It is replaced by a fierce, protective loyalty. Third, you must construct a narrative of moral superiority. People need to believe that they are not merely working for a strategic objective, but fighting for a righteous cause. You must paint your adversaries not simply as competitors, but as the embodiment of everything your group despises. By creating a sharp, polarizing contrast between your noble crusade and the dark, treacherous nature of your enemies, you forge an internal cohesion that no amount of money could ever purchase. When survival and victory are framed as a matter of absolute good versus absolute evil, the group ceases to be an organization and transforms into a fanatical, unstoppable movement. Finally, you must master the delicate chemistry of harshness and kindness. The leader who attempts to motivate solely through fear and brutal punishment will inevitably breed a culture of hidden resentment and eventual sabotage. The troops will perform only the bare minimum required to avoid the lash, and their creativity will die. Conversely, the leader who constantly showers the group with unwarranted praise, easy rewards, and endless leniency will cultivate a soft, spoiled, and deeply entitled army. They will collapse at the first sign of genuine hardship. The strategic warrior maintains an aura of suspense. Be fiercely demanding and establish impossibly high standards. Be slow to praise. When your approval is finally earned, it will land with the profound impact of a religious blessing. Image the ocean's tide. It ebbs and flows with such overwhelming planetary power that absolutely no one standing in its path can escape its pull or swim against its massive current. Like the moon suspended in the night sky, you must become the invisible magnetic force that sets this tide into motion, carrying everything and everyone along in its relentless, unified wake. Authority. The way means inducing the people to have the same aim as the leadership so that they will share death and share life without fear of danger. Sun Tzu, 4th century BC. Reversal. If supreme morale is highly contagious, you must never forget that its exact opposite, paralyzing fear, creeping doubt, and cancerous discontent, can spread through your ranks with the speed of a lethal wildfire. The only effective strategy for dealing with internal panic is to ruthlessly cut it off before it can metastasize into open rebellion. In 58 BC, during the brutally difficult Gallic War, Julius Caesar was preparing to march his legions against the terrifying Germanic leader, Ariovistus. Wild, exaggerated rumors regarding the superhuman size, ferocity, and savagery of the German warriors began to circulate through the Roman camp. The army, previously victorious, suddenly became panicky, paralyzed, and openly mutinous. Caesar understood that he had only hours to reverse the dynamic. He acted with terrifying speed. First, he instantly arrested the primary rumor-mongers, silencing the source of the infection. Next, he assembled his soldiers and addressed them personally. He did not try to soothe their fears with gentle logic. Instead, he aggressively shamed them. He reminded them of the magnificent courage of their Roman ancestors, who had repeatedly crushed these same Germanic tribes in the past. He declared with absolute disgust that he refused to lead a generation of cowards into battle. Since only his elite 10th Legion appeared immune to this disgraceful panic, he announced he would march with them alone. The rest of the army could stay behind in their shame. As Caesar dramatically prepared to march off with only the 10th Legion, the remainder of the Roman army was overwhelmed by a profound sense of disgraced honor. Ashamed of their weakness, they fell to their knees and begged Caesar to forgive them and allow them to fight. With a brilliant show of calculated reluctance, he finally granted their request. These once terrified men, their pride wounded and their honor on the line, marched into the forest and fought with a fanatical, unparalleled ferocity, completely annihilating the German forces. When facing panic within your own ranks, you must act like Caesar. Turn back the tide of fear not with logic, but with the powerful psychological weapon of social shaming. Appeal directly to their pride. Make them viscerally ashamed of their moment of weakness. Remind them of the great things they have accomplished in the past and fiercely highlight how far they are currently falling short of that magnificent ideal. This sudden, violent psychological shock will instantly snap them out of their madness and forcefully reverse the destructive dynamic. Chapter 8. Pick your battles carefully. The perfect economy strategy. To exist in the physical world is to be bound by an inexorable architecture of limitations. Our time is strictly finite, our internal reservoirs of energy are easily depleted, and our material capacities can extend only so far before they fracture under the strain. The supreme danger in the theater of conflict arises when we become blinded by the glittering allure of a prize and aggressively attempt to push past these natural boundaries. Enticed by the prospect of total victory, we overextend our forces, plunging into battles without calculating the hidden, subterranean costs of the engagement. Every conflict exacts a heavy toll. Precious time is squandered, political goodwill is irreversibly burned, and enemies are embittered, harboring a desire for vengeance that will inevitably resurface. You must cultivate a chilling awareness of your own limits and select your battles with merciless precision. Frequently, the most devastating strategy is to abstain from direct confrontation entirely, choosing instead to undermine your adversary through quiet, covert attrition. When direct engagement is absolutely unavoidable, you must maneuver the conflict onto your own terrain, striking exclusively at the opponent's vulnerabilities. By ensuring that the war remains exceedingly expensive for your enemy and remarkably cheap for yourself, you practice perfect economy, gaining the endurance to outlast even the most colossal foe. To comprehend the catastrophic spiral of uneconomical warfare, one must look to the shores of Italy in 281 BC. The wealthy, cultured city of Tarentum found itself locked in a sudden escalating dispute with the relentlessly expanding Republic of Rome. The citizens of Tarentum possessed vast riches but lacked the martial discipline to defend themselves. In their desperation, they looked across the sea to King Pyrrhus of Epirus, a renowned Greek warrior who hungered to carve out a massive empire and rival the legacy of his distant cousin, Alexander the Great. The Tarentines offered Pyrrhus a seductive proposition. If he crossed the sea with his forces, they would finance his campaign and provide a massive allied army. From the ashes of a defeated Rome, Pyrrhus could sweep across the Mediterranean and achieve immortal glory. Dazzled by this vision, Pyrrhus set sail with the most formidable Greek army ever assembled for an Italian campaign, a magnificent force of infantry, cavalry, and terrifying war elephants. Upon his arrival, however, the illusion immediately shattered. The Tarentines had raised no army. They had merely lured him across the sea to fight their war for them. Forced to rely exclusively on his own men, Pyrrhus marched to meet the Roman legions. He possessed absolute tactical brilliance and managed to defeat the Romans in a massive, blood-soaked engagement, but the cost was horrifying. The Romans fought with a grim, suicidal tenacity, slaughtering thousands of his elite veterans. Pyrrhus assumed that this crushing defeat would break the Roman spirit, compelling them to sue for peace. Instead, the Romans simply retreated, absorbed the losses, and raised a fresh army from their seemingly inexhaustible civilian reserves. Pyrrhus was forced to engage them again, achieving another tactical victory that left his own forces further decimated. As he surveyed the battlefield, littered with the bodies of his finest commanders and irreplaceable soldiers, he famously lamented that another such victory would utterly destroy him. He had entered a war of attrition against an adversary possessing bottomless resources. His brilliant battlefield maneuvers were irrelevant. The sheer mathematics of the conflict guaranteed his eventual ruin. Exhausted, his ranks thinned, and his grand ambitions reduced to ashes, Pyrrhus was eventually forced to abandon his Italian campaign, securing his name in history only as the architect of the Pyrrhic victory, a triumph that bleeds the victor dry. Contrast this fatal hemorrhage of resources with the pristine strategic economy exercised by Queen Elizabeth I of England when confronted by the terrifying spectre of the Spanish Armada. In the late 16th century, Spain was the undisputed titan of the globe, possessing limitless wealth from the New World and a sprawling, invincible military apparatus. England, by comparison, was a secondary power with a fragile economy and barely a standing army. When King Philip II of Spain launched his colossal fleet to crush the English, a conventional ruler would have bankrupted their nation attempting to build a mirrored armada to meet the Spanish head-on. Elizabeth understood the law of strategic limitation. She recognized that matching strength against strength would guarantee England's annihilation. Instead, she meticulously analyzed the structural weaknesses of the Spanish behemoth. The galleons were massive, heavily armed, and psychologically intimidating. But they were also notoriously slow, difficult to maneuver, and agonizingly expensive to maintain. England's fleet was small, but it was extraordinarily agile, navigated by men intimately familiar with the treacherous currents of the English Channel. Elizabeth refused a frontal engagement. She deployed her nimble ships to harass the Armada, darting in to inflict damage and melting away before the Spanish could bring their heavy guns to bear. She utilized fire ships to shatter their tight defensive formations and leveraged her superior intelligence networks to keep the Spanish entirely disoriented. By fighting strictly on her own terms, Elizabeth made the war incredibly cheap for England and impossibly expensive for Spain. She drained Philip's treasury and exhausted his commanders without ever committing her core forces to a decisive all-or-nothing battle. Ultimately, the frustrated and battered Armada was forced to flee, broken not by a superior military machine but by a masterful execution of perfect economy. The stark reality of existence is defined by limitations. In the natural world, an animal operates within strict boundaries. It does not expend vital energy attempting to accumulate endless stockpiles of food, nor does it engage in unnecessary fights that might result in a debilitating injury. It conserves its power, executing the perfect economy of motion, utilizing only the exact amount of force required to secure its prey or defend its territory. In societies defined by modern abundance, however, human beings frequently lose this primal tether to reality. Shielded from the immediate threat of death, we hallucinate that we possess infinite time, limitless energy, and the capacity to conquer every obstacle through sheer force of will. This intoxicating illusion breeds a fatal lack of discipline. We launch ourselves into sprawling conflicts, entangle ourselves in endless arguments, and squander our internal resources on battles that yield no strategic value. The strategic warrior must ruthlessly purge this romantic delusion. You must anchor your mind in the unforgiving soil of reality, embracing the terrifying truth that your time is running out and your energies are finite. This awareness of mortality should not induce despair. Rather, it should forge a laser-like focus. When you recognize that you cannot fight everywhere, you stop reacting to every provocation. You ignore the petty insults and the chaotic dramas that drain the vitality of lesser minds. You preserve your strength exclusively for the precise moment and the exact theater where your actions will yield the maximum possible impact. This philosophy was perfectly embodied by the North Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Giap during his grueling campaigns against the technologically supreme forces of France and the United States. A conventional military mind would have viewed the overwhelming American firepower, their endless fleets of helicopters, and their sprawling supply chains as an insurmountable deficit. Giap, however, recognized that attempting to fight the Americans symmetrically, investing his meager resources in matching their heavy artillery or air power, would be suicidal. Instead, Giap embraced his limitations and transformed them into devastating weapons. Because he lacked mechanized transport, he relied on an invisible network of peasant coolies who ferried supplies through dense jungle canopies that American bombers could not penetrate. Because he could not win a static, pitched battle against superior weaponry, he orchestrated a fluid, phantom war of ambushes and psychological terror. He refused to provide the Americans with a solid target to destroy, forcing them to expend billions of dollars and immense political capital striking at the shadows of the jungle. By utilizing the absolute minimum of material resources, Giap generated a maximum psychological impact, slowly draining the American will to fight. The most dangerous assumption you can make is that a superiority in resources or technological advantage guarantees victory. Over-reliance on such assets breeds intellectual laziness and a rigid, predictable style of combat. When friction arises, the wealthy army simply attempts to overpower the problem by throwing more resources into the abyss. True strategic power is generated by creativity and adaptation, traits that are forcefully birthed by necessity and limitation. By accepting your constraints, you are forced to invent, to maneuver, and to outthink an adversary who relies on brute force. You must adopt the mindset of a master craftsman, analyzing his raw materials. Do not begin your campaign by dreaming of the glorious endgame or constructing an idealized plan in a vacuum. Start by coldly auditing the precise means at your disposal. The specific talents you possess, the actual morale of your allies, the undeniable physical and political realities of the terrain. Ground your strategy entirely in these imperfect materials. Let your grand design blossom organically from the limitations you face. When you fight with this perfect economy, you you cease to be a combatant desperately swinging a heavy sword, and you become a force of nature, fluid, unyielding, and impossible to exhaust. Chapter 9. Turn the tables. The counterattack strategy. There is a deeply ingrained, almost primal human instinct that equates taking the initiative with power and control. We are conditioned to believe that striking the first blow demonstrates unflinching courage, forces the adversary onto their heels, and allows us to dictate the terms of the conflict. Yet, in the brutal and unforgiving mathematics of warfare, moving first frequently places you at a profound, often fatal disadvantage. The aggressor, by the very nature of their assault, must reveal their hidden intentions, commit their irreplaceable resources, and expose their vulnerable flanks. The physical and psychological act of attacking exhausts vital energy and thrusts the aggressor forward into unknown, potentially hostile territory. The master of the defensive war understands the profound, hidden power of holding back. By deliberately allowing the enemy to strike first, you invite them to overextend. You observe their strategy as it fully unfolds, remaining perfectly still and impenetrable while they expend their kinetic energy against your hardened defenses. When they are frustrated, unbalanced, and physically fatigued by the sheer effort of their own aggression, you launch the counterattack. This strike is not a separate, disconnected maneuver. It is a seamless continuation of their own momentum, turning the enemy's aggressive force into the precise instrument of their own destruction. The draw them in tactic. In the autumn of 1974, the heavyweight boxing championship of the world was to be contested in the sweltering heat of Zaire. The challenger, Muhammad Ali, was attempting to reclaim his throne from the reigning champion, George Foreman. Foreman was not merely a boxer, he was a terrifying, elemental force of destruction. He was a monstrously powerful puncher who had systematically annihilated his previous, highly skilled opponents in the early rounds, leaving them unconscious and shattered on the canvas. Ali, significantly older and visibly slower than in his prime, was widely predicted by experts not just to lose, but to be brutally and permanently injured. The conventional strategy for a lighter, faster fighter facing a massive puncher was to dance on the outside, utilizing constant lateral movement to avoid the heavy blows while scoring with quick, stinging jabs. Ali knew, however, that the ring in Zaire was heavily padded, making footwork sluggish and exhausting. Furthermore, the immense African heat would inevitably drain a dancer's stamina. If Ali attempted to run, Foreman would eventually corner him and crush him against the ropes through sheer physical mass. Ali recognized that attempting to outbox Foreman symmetrically would be an elegant form of suicide. Therefore, Ali devised a strategy that completely defied all established boxing logic. When the opening bell rang, Ali did not retreat into a defensive dance, nor did he attempt to seize the center of the ring. Instead, he walked backward, planting himself firmly against the loose ropes. He raised his gloves to protect his head, tucked his chin, and deliberately invited the monster to attack. Foreman, enraged by this apparent surrender, eager for a swift execution, unleashed a relentless, terrifying barrage of heavy punches. He swung with maximum kinetic force, targeting Ali's head and body. For round after agonizing round, Ali remained trapped against the ropes, absorbing the terrifying impact of the blows on his arms and gloves. To the terrified spectators, it appeared as though Ali was being systematically beaten to death. Yet, amidst the violence, Ali would occasionally lean forward and whisper taunts into Foreman's ear, questioning his power and mocking his inability to score a knockout. These whispers further infuriated the champion, goading him into swinging even harder, abandoning all technique in a desperate desire to obliterate the man mocking him. By the middle rounds, a profound shift occurred in the physical geometry of the fight. The immense energy required to constantly throw such massive, devastating blows, combined with the suffocating heat and the psychological torment of his own mounting frustration, began to rapidly drain Foreman's stamina. His arms grew heavy, like lead weights. His punches lost their terrifying, concussive snap and became slow, pushing blows. He had completely overextended himself against an unyielding, elastic defense. In the 8th round, Ali recognized the subtle shift in his opponent's eyes, the unmistakable glaze of total exhaustion. Realizing that Foreman was physically unbalanced and his offensive momentum had entirely collapsed, Ali suddenly exploded from his defensive shell on the ropes. With a crisp, precise, and perfectly timed combination, he struck the towering champion. Foreman, having completely abandoned his own defense in his blind pursuit of destruction, possessed no armor to absorb the impact. He crashed heavily to the canvas, unable to rise, and Ali secured one of the most miraculous strategic victories in the history of combat. Interpretation. George Foreman's absolute reliance on overwhelming offensive power was masterfully transformed into his singular, fatal vulnerability. Ali understood that if he attacked first, or if he attempted to fight Foreman on Foreman's terms, he would be playing directly into his opponent's colossal strengths. By absorbing the initial assault and turning the ropes into a shock absorber, Ali allowed Foreman to systematically defeat himself. The counterattack is the ultimate realization of this psychological and physical principle. It relies on the absolute truth that an attacker, blinded by their own forward momentum and consumed by the primal desire to inflict damage, rarely considers their own defense. When you permit the enemy to advance, they naturally and inevitably leave gaping voids in their armor. The counterattack specifically targets these newly created unprotected spaces, striking with concentrated, lethal force precisely at the moment when the enemy is most exhausted, most frustrated, and least prepared to defend themselves. By surrendering the initial initiative, you gain the supreme advantage of the final, decisive blow. Keys to warfare. The aggressive impulse is an intoxicating, deeply seductive narcotic. It feels incredibly powerful and validating to launch an offensive, to seize the initiative, and to aggressively dictate the pace of the conflict. However, true strategic dominance requires the profound, unnatural discipline to suppress this primal instinct. When you initiate the attack, you are effectively operating in the dark. You do not know the hidden strengths of the enemy's defense, nor can you anticipate the traps they have meticulously laid for you. Conversely, when you force yourself to wait, the entire battlefield becomes brilliantly illuminated. By moving first, the enemy is forced to show you their hand. They reveal their true intentions, their preferred tactical rhythms, and their hidden structural weaknesses. To execute the counterattack perfectly, you must cultivate an aura of vulnerability. If you appear too formidable, too heavily fortified, or too aggressive, the enemy will hesitate, refusing to commit their forces and overextend. You must feign weakness. You must be willing to retreat strategically, yielding ground to offer a tantalizing target that the enemy's ego simply cannot resist. You must expertly bait the trap. Draw them out of their secure, entrenched fortifications and into the open ground where their movements are entirely predictable and their supply lines are stretched to the breaking point. Furthermore, you must train your mind to remain icy, detached, and intensely calculating while you are under direct assault. The counterattack is never a blind, panicked reaction to being hit. It is a meticulously timed, deliberate explosion. You must possess the psychological fortitude to absorb the enemy's initial blows, the insults, the economic pressures, the aggressive maneuvers, without losing your presence of mind. You must wait patiently for the exact, fleeting moment when their offensive momentum crests and begins to inevitably break. That fraction of a second, when they are overextended, frustrated, and gasping for air, is the precise moment to turn the tables and strike back with devastating, overwhelming force. Image the coiled spring. It sits quietly, absorbing the heavy weight pressed violently upon it. It does not fiercely resist the downward force. Instead, it yields, sinking lower and lower, gathering immense, invisible, latent energy within its compressed, metallic structure. But the exact moment the downward pressure falters or shifts its balance, the spring violently releases all of its stored kinetic power, launching the heavy weight back into the air with a devastating explosive force that the original downward motion created. Authority. The good fighter puts himself into a position which makes defeat impossible and does not miss the moment for defeating the enemy. Thus it is that in war the victorious strategist only seeks battle after the victory has been won, whereas he who is destined to defeat first fights and afterwards looks for victory. Sun Tzu, 4th century BC. Reversal. The strategy of the counterattack relies absolutely on the enemy's willingness to act aggressively and commit the first error. If the adversary possesses a strategic mind equal to your own, they may recognize your trap and flatly refuse to attack, preferring to maintain their secure defensive posture. In this scenario, you are left locked in a paralyzing staring contest, with neither side willing to expose themselves. When faced with such a disciplined opponent, you must seamlessly pivot your approach. You cannot simply wait forever. You must initiate a series of small, irritating, and highly calculated probing attacks. These strikes are not designed to destroy the enemy or conquer territory. They are designed exclusively to infuriate them and provoke the rash, unbalanced response you desire. You must become the matador, waving the red cape, goading the cautious bull into a blind, reckless charge that will ultimately lead to its slaughter. Chapter 10. Create a threatening presence. Deterrent strategies. In this chapter, the focus shifts to the psychological power of deterrence, preventing conflicts before they even begin by projecting an intimidating and formidable image. The text explores how cultivating a reputation for unpredictability, boldness, or disproportionate retaliation can make opponents hesitate before launching an attack. By carefully managing one's outward presence and making the potential costs of any engagement appear unacceptably high, a strategist can successfully protect their interests and maintain their position without having to expend vital resources in actual combat. The core lesson is that psychological maneuvering and the projection of power can effectively secure your boundaries against potential aggressors. Chapter 11. Trade space for time, the non-engagement strategy. From our earliest days, society conditions us to view retreat as the ultimate humiliating failure. We are taught to fiercely stand our ground, to defend our territory, our ego, and our established positions at all costs. To back down is perceived as cowardice. To surrender physical or intellectual ground is equated with total defeat. But in the ruthless mathematics of conflict, territory is merely a physical illusion. Survival, momentum, and time are the true, irreplaceable currencies of warfare. When you find yourself facing a vastly superior force, standing your ground out of stubborn pride is an elegant form of suicide. You must learn the profound counterintuitive art of trading space for time. By deliberately yielding ground, you categorically refuse to give your enemy the decisive, kinetic clash they desperately crave. You force them to march into a void, stretching their supply lines, exhausting their psychological resources, and fighting the heavy friction of the environment rather than your actual forces. The scorched earth tactic. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte crossed the Niemen River into Russia, commanding the Grande Armée, a colossal, seemingly invincible machine of destruction, numbering over 600,000 men. Napoleon's objective was terrifyingly simple: a rapid, crushing, decisive victory near the border that would instantly force Tsar Alexander I to his knees. The Russian army, vastly outnumbered and politically divided, was under the command of General Barclay de Tolly-Morol. Barclay recognized a horrifying truth. If he stood his ground and fought the French Leviathan on the border, the entire Russian army would be utterly annihilated in a single, bloody afternoon. He made the agonizing, deeply unpopular strategic decision to retreat. As Napoleon's magnificent army advanced, they encountered only desolation. The Russians ruthlessly burned their own crops, destroyed their own bridges, and poisoned their own wells. They offered the emperor nothing but empty, charred space. The French army, meticulously engineered for rapid, decisive engagements and living off the land, immediately began to starve. Their horses died by the thousands. Napoleon captured city after city, pushing relentlessly deeper into the massive, suffocating expanse of the Russian interior, forever chasing the seductive illusion of a final, triumphant battle. Even when the Tsar, bowing to intense political pressure, replaced the cautious Barclay with the aggressive General Kutuzov, the foundational strategy remained largely intact. Kutuzov fought a brutal, necessary engagement at Borodino to satisfy Russian honor, but ultimately chose to abandon the sacred city of Moscow itself rather than lose his army in a final stand. When Napoleon finally rode into the abandoned, burning capital of Moscow, he firmly believed he had won the war. He possessed the physical territory, but he possessed only empty space. The Russian army remained fully intact, lurking in the shadows, and the lethal Russian winter was rapidly descending. Realizing his catastrophic overextension and the impossibility of feeding his army in the ashes, Napoleon was forced to order a retreat. That retreat swiftly transformed into one of the most gruesome military disasters in human history. The plummeting temperatures, mass starvation, and relentless guerrilla harassment by Russian Cossacks utterly dismantled the Grande Armée. Napoleon had traded the lives of 500,000 men for a temporary hold on useless geography. The Russians, mastering the supreme law of perfect economy, had traded their physical space to buy the critical time necessary for the winter to arrive and execute their enemy for them. Interpretation: Napoleon Bonaparte was the undisputed master of the decisive battle. He thrived on the violent, kinetic clash of organized masses. Barclay and Kutuzov defeated him by systematically denying him the very medium in which his genius operated. They weaponized the vast, terrifying emptiness of their own country. In our own daily battles, we frequently encounter overwhelming, aggressive forces. A hostile corporate entity attempting a takeover, a dominant market competitor with endless capital, or an intensely aggressive individual seeking to dominate a social dynamic. Our fragile ego instantly screams at us to fight back, to defend our pride, to stubbornly hold our ground. But engaging a vastly superior force on their preferred terms is a strategic catastrophe. You must learn to ruthlessly detach your ego from your immediate territory. Territory, whether it is physical land, a specific market share, or a momentary position in an argument, can almost always be recaptured later. However, a destroyed army, a shattered professional reputation, or a bankrupt business cannot be resurrected. When the enemy is overwhelmingly strong, retreat. Give them absolutely nothing to strike. Let them punch the empty air. As they advance into the void you deliberately leave behind, they will naturally overextend their resources. Their initial adrenaline will evaporate, their anger will cloud their tactical judgment, and their aggressive momentum will inevitably decay into profound exhaustion. Keys to warfare. Aggression and forward momentum are deeply intoxicating. When an opponent launches an attack, their psychological and physiological state is entirely primed for violent impact. If they encounter immediate, stubborn resistance, it only fuels their internal fire and validates their aggression. If, however, they encounter nothing, they become profoundly disoriented. The strategy of non-engagement is the ultimate psychological weapon against a hyper-aggressive foe. First, you must brutally master your own ego. Society and your peers will invariably label your tactical retreat as cowardice. You will face intense, stinging pressure from your allies, your colleagues, and your own wounded pride to stand up and fight like a traditional warrior. You must recognize that true strategic courage lies in the cold, calculated choice of long-term survival over short-term vanity. The warrior who knows exactly when to fight and exactly when not to fight possesses the ultimate power. Second, use the retreat to actively dictate the terms of the eventual engagement. You are never fleeing in a blind panic. You are deliberately drawing the enemy into a carefully selected arena. By retreating, you are forcefully stretching their lines of communication, forcing them to operate in unfamiliar, hostile territory and patiently waiting for the inevitable friction of their own rapid advance to weaken their armor. Third, you must profoundly internalize the difference between space and time. Space is physical, tangible, and infinitely replaceable. Time is invisible, strictly irreversible, and the absolute arbiter of survival. By willingly trading space, you purchase the precious time required to forge new alliances, gather vital intelligence, allow the enemy's internal political weaknesses to fester, and let the sheer weight of their own aggression collapse upon them. In the modern conversational world, this strategy translates perfectly into the refusal to engage in endless, draining arguments or public debates. When a rival attempts to bait you into a hostile confrontation, remain perfectly silent. Yield the immediate rhetorical ground. Let them speak. Let them boast. Let them aggressively overplay their hand. Your silence is a terrifying void they will desperately attempt to fill with more words, eventually exposing their own deep insecurities and making a fatal, unforced error. Image. The vast steppe. A seemingly endless, barren, undulating landscape. The invading army marches aggressively forward, conquering mile after dusty mile of dirt and grass, firmly believing they are achieving victory. But there is no center to conquer, no vital organ to pierce. They are simply marching deeper and deeper into a suffocating ocean of emptiness, where they will slowly starve, freeze, and disappear entirely. Authority. When the enemy advances, we retreat. When the enemy halts, we harass. When the enemy tires, we attack. When the enemy retreats, we pursue. Mao Zedong, 1893 to 1976. Reversal retreat is a highly delicate maneuver that must never be allowed to devolve into a chaotic, panicked rout. A disorganized, fearful flight destroys the psychological morale of your own personnel and invites the enemy to effortlessly slaughter you from behind. The retreat must be highly disciplined, mathematically calculated, and executed with absolute terrifying precision. Furthermore, there is an absolute limit to how much space you can safely trade. If you yield critical infrastructure, irreplaceable resources, or the spiritual heart of your organization, the retreat transforms into a permanent, fatal surrender. You must always maintain a secure, impenetrable base of operations from which you can preserve your core strength and eventually launch the devastating counterattack when the time finally belongs to you. Chapter 12. Lose battles but win the war. Grand strategy. The fundamental difference between the tactician and the strategist lies in the depth of their vision. The tactician is entirely consumed by the immediate friction of the present moment, the argument at hand, the skirmish currently unfolding, the pressing desire to win the battle of the day. The grand strategist, however, operates on an entirely elevated plane. Grand strategy is the magnificent art of looking far beyond the immediate clash of arms, extending your gaze deep into the horizon of time. It demands the profound emotional discipline to ignore the seductive lure of temporary victories and the petty provocations that drag lesser minds into exhausting, meaningless conflicts. By fixing your attention exclusively on your ultimate objective, you orchestrate a long-term campaign where even deliberate short-term defeats are utilized as calculated steps toward a definitive triumph. Let your adversaries exhaust their energy, relishing their minor tactical successes. The grand strategist is the architect of the final outcome, securing the ultimate reward of the last laugh. To comprehend the sheer disorienting power of grand strategy, one must examine the campaigns of Alexander the Great. As he initiated his monumental war against the sprawling Persian Empire, his generals were frequently bewildered by his decisions. His maneuvers appeared to lack any recognizable logic or consistency. He would advance with terrifying speed, then inexplicably halt. He would conquer a territory, and then, instead of relentlessly pursuing the fleeing Persian king Darius, he would suddenly wheel his army southward toward the Mediterranean coast and Egypt. To the traditional military minds of his staff, he seemed to be squandering his momentum. What his generals failed to grasp was that Alexander was not merely fighting battles, he was inventing a new geometry of war. He recognized that if he simply chased the Persian army deep into the heart of their massive territory, he would overextend his supply lines, exhaust his men, and leave his rear completely vulnerable to the formidable Persian navy. Therefore, he executed a grand, overarching design. By systematically conquering the coastal cities of the Mediterranean and marching into the rich lands of Egypt, he effectively destroyed the Persian navy without fighting a single naval battle. He simply deprived them of all their ports and supply bases. He secured his flanks, enriched his treasury, and established an unassailable infrastructure. When he finally marched inland to decisively crush the Persian forces at Arbela, the empire had already been systematically dismantled from the outside in. His victory was merely the final, inevitable stroke of a meticulously plotted campaign that his enemies and even his own commanders had lacked the vision to comprehend. This same profound depth of vision dictated the outcome of the Vietnam War. The American military machine operated on a tactical level, measuring success by body counts, secured hills, and victorious firefights. The North Vietnamese leadership, however, fought a war of grand strategy. They recognized that attempting to defeat the Americans in conventional pitched battles was impossible. Instead, they extended their vision far beyond the physical geography of the jungle. They identified the true battlefield, the political will of the American public. The Tet Offensive was not a military victory for the North. In fact, they suffered catastrophic casualties, but strategically, it was a masterpiece. By demonstrating that they could strike anywhere, at any time, they shattered the illusion of American progress. They beamed the terrifying reality of an endless war directly into the living rooms of the American populace. The North Vietnamese did not win a single major conventional battle, but by aiming their campaign at the cultural and political center of gravity, they entirely collapsed the enemy's resolve and won the war. The tragedy of human existence is our inherent tendency to default to our animalistic nature. Animals respond only to the immediate stimuli in their environment. They cannot conceptualize the distant future or analyze the sprawling chain of consequences. While humanity evolved the capacity for reason and abstract thought, the reactive, emotional animal within us constantly fights for dominance. When we feel threatened or desire a quick reward, we lose our perspective. We lash out, we grab for the immediate prize, and we completely ignore the long-term ramifications of our actions. The ancient Greeks perfectly understood this dual nature. They recognized that all human tragedy stems from limited vision. Like Oedipus, who believed he was acting righteously while blindly marching toward his own destruction, we frequently orchestrate our own ruin because our sight is clouded by emotion and ego. Opposed to this tragic blindness, the Greeks elevated the ideal of supreme prudence, embodied by the mythological figure of Odysseus. Odysseus was the master strategist precisely because he always subordinated his immediate passions to his long-term survival. He looked past the immediate danger, calculated the hidden variables, and possessed the intellectual stamina to view the world with a cold, dispassionate eye. He represented the zenith of human potential, the ability to peer into the future and shape it through calculated action. To master grand strategy, you must actively cultivate this Odyssean vision. You must forcefully expand your perspective in every conceivable direction. Do not merely look at the person standing directly in front of you. Analyze the entire network of relationships, the political currents, and the unseen cultural forces that shape the environment. You must train your mind to trace the causal chain of events, understanding that every action you take today will ripple outward, creating secondary and tertiary effects weeks, months, or years down the line. The foundation of this expansive vision is the establishment of an absolute, crystal-clear ultimate objective. You cannot navigate a complex campaign if your goals are hazy, driven by vague desires for success or recognition. You must define your destiny with microscopic precision, like Napoleon visualizing the exact geographic location where a campaign would conclude and the specific terms of the ensuing treaty, or a young Lyndon B. Johnson meticulously plotting his decades-long ascent to the presidency. Your ultimate goal must be a tangible reality in your mind. When this overarching objective is firmly established, the chaotic noise of daily life loses its power to distract you. You will no longer be seduced by glittering but irrelevant opportunities. You will possess the terrifying discipline to endure a momentary humiliation, to concede a minor argument, or to absorb a calculated loss, knowing with absolute certainty that this temporary sacrifice is maneuvering you into a position of unassailable dominance for the final decisive strike. Grand strategy is not the application of brute force. It is the triumph of absolute, unwavering rationality over the chaotic, emotional landscape of human conflict. Chapter 13. Know your enemy. The intelligence strategy. In the theater of conflict, the most dangerous battlefield is the human mind, and the greatest vulnerability is ignorance of your opponent's true nature. This chapter delves into the deep psychological necessity of intelligence gathering. It explores the philosophical reality that human beings constantly wear masks, projecting curated images of strength, morality, or compliance to hide their actual intentions and insecurities.
To navigate this landscape successfully, a strategist must become a masterful student of human psychology. You cannot rely on what people say, as words are easily manipulated. Instead, you must learn to read the subtle, unguarded actions that reveal their true character. By piercing the facade and understanding how your adversary thinks, what they fear, and what they secretly value, you gain a monumental advantage. This intelligence allows you to anticipate their moves and tailor your actions to exploit their specific psychological blind spots. Ultimately, the chapter argues that the most profound victories are won not through brute physical force, but through superior psychological insight and the mastery of human nature. Chapter 14. Overwhelm resistance with speed and suddenness. The Blitzkrieg strategy. In a world populated by the indecisive and the overly cautious, the calculated application of speed grants a terrifying, almost supernatural power. Human nature recoils from suddenness. People desperately attempt to slow down the pace of events to give themselves the illusion of control. When you strike with unprecedented velocity, you deprive your opponents of the time required to think, process, or prepare. They are forced into a reactive, highly emotional state, unbalancing their judgment and compelling them into fatal errors. If you immediately follow this initial shock with another completely unexpected maneuver, their defenses collapse under the weight of compounded panic. The supreme execution of this strategy requires a deceptive prelude, a deliberate lull that lures the enemy into a comfortable slumber. Then, out of the void, you strike with unrelenting, explosive kinetic energy, generating a psychological momentum that is impossible to arrest. Consider the immense, sprawling empire of Muhammad II, the Shah of Khwarizm, in the early 13th century. His domain encompassed modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, and vast stretches of Central Asia, boasting a massive army of over 400,000 fiercely trained men. When an escalating diplomatic dispute with Genghis Khan, the leader of the Mongol nation to the east, inevitably resulted in war, the Shah felt no anxiety. He calculated that the Mongols, numbering half the size of his own forces, were little more than nomadic barbarians. To protect his heartland, the Shah established a formidable defensive perimeter along the Sir Darya River. To the north lay an impassable desert, to the south a treacherous detour. Operating under the classical static principles of warfare, he concentrated his forces, confident that his numerical superiority and geographical advantages would effortlessly absorb any Mongol assault. The Mongols, however, did not operate according to the conventional laws of war. Genghis Khan had mastered a psychological cadence of combat that the ancient Chinese referred to as slow, slow, quick, quick. The first phase was exhaustive, meticulous preparation. The Mongols secured local guides who knew the secret invisible routes through the supposedly impenetrable northern desert. The second phase was the deliberate setup, lulling the enemy into a false sense of superiority. When the first Mongol vanguard engaged the Shah's forces in the south, they fought briefly and then retreated, deliberately appearing haggard and weak. The Shah's confidence swelled. He believed the Mongols were exhausted and entirely manageable. Then the tempo violently accelerated. A Mongol army suddenly materialized in the north, bypassing the river entirely and sacking the city of Otrar. Stunned by their velocity and their impossible geographic position, the Shah hurriedly diverted troops northward. Immediately, 2 more Mongol armies swept down the river. They moved with a terrifying fluidity, unburdened by heavy supply wagons, living off the blood and milk of their spare horses.
They communicated over vast distances with signaling flags, executing complex maneuvers with the synchronized precision of a flock of birds. Before the Shah could even comprehend the geometry of the battlefield, an army under Genghis Khan himself inexplicably appeared at the gates of Bukhara, deep in the absolute center of the Shah's empire. They had miraculously crossed the impassable northern desert. The sheer, impossible suddenness of their arrival shattered the psychological resolve of the Khwarezmian Empire. Generals panicked, soldiers deserted en masse, and the once mighty Shah was forced into a desperate, pathetic flight, eventually dying of starvation on a remote island. The Mongol victory was secured not merely by the physical speed of their horses, but by the devastating velocity of their strategic execution, which consistently moved faster than the Shah's mind could process reality. This paradigm of warfare, the Blitzkrieg, found its modern mechanical expression in the spring of 1940 when the German military machine tore through the Ardennes forest to shatter the French defenses. The Allies possessed formidable armies, but their architecture of thought was static and rigid. When the German armor broke through with unprecedented speed, bypassing conventional strongholds, the Allied command structure simply could not adjust. By the time a French or British general formulated a rational countermaneuver, the battlefield had already mutated. They were permanently trapped one step behind the rolling wave of destruction. To harness this devastating power in your own life, you must recognize that the modern environment is saturated with distraction and anxiety. People inherently despise being rushed. They construct elaborate psychological fortresses of caution, endless deliberation, and bureaucratic delay to insulate themselves from the chaotic pace of the world. The strategic warrior weaponizes this exact vulnerability. When you launch an initiative, you must do so with a suddenness that violently breaches these defensive walls. You compel your adversary to act before they are emotionally or intellectually prepared. Stripped of their comforting routines, they will inevitably default to rash, uncalculated reactions. The mechanics of the Blitzkrieg rely entirely on supreme organization, not merely frantic rushing. It demands a highly mobile, deeply cohesive group where communication is instantaneous and execution is fluid. You must identify the absolute point of least resistance in your opponent's posture, the Ardennes forest of their psychology or their business model, and funnel all your initial energy through that narrow breach to build unstoppable momentum. Furthermore, this velocity must be deployed in the realm of diplomacy and negotiation. The statesman Henry Kissinger frequently utilized the slow, quick rhythm to dominate the negotiating table. He would initiate talks with agonizing slowness, engaging in weeks of bland, meandering banter, lulling the opposing diplomats into a state of relaxed complacency. Then, precisely as the deadline loomed, he would abruptly shatter the calm, delivering a barrage of rigid demands. Deprived of the time necessary to analyze the implications and panicked by the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure, the opposition would frequently collapse, granting massive concessions simply to resolve the blinding tension. Speed is a multiplier of force. It masks your internal weaknesses and magnifies your apparent strength, granting you an aura of terrifying omnipresence. But it cannot be sustained indefinitely. It is an explosive release of gathered energy, a temporary state of maximum violence that must be meticulously planned in the shadows and executed only when the enemy is looking the other way. Chapter 15. Control the dynamic, forcing strategies. In the daily interactions of our lives, we are immersed in an invisible, unending struggle for control. People are constantly attempting to maneuver you into acting in their own interests, seeking to dictate the terms, the pace, and the emotional temperature of the relationship. When you passively allow others to establish the rules of engagement, you surrender your autonomy. You become a reactionary force, constantly adjusting to their initiatives, answering their questions, and fighting on the terrain of their choosing. The only way to achieve strategic dominance is to elevate your play, making your grasp for control more insidious, intelligent, and encompassing. Instead of exhausting your energy trying to dominate every single move your opponent makes, you must work to define the overarching nature of the dynamic itself. You must shift the conflict onto your own ground, actively altering the pace, the stakes, and the emotional context to suit your specific advantages. The ancient masters of martial arts referred to this absolute dominance as pressing down the pillow. It signifies the deliberate, relentless effort to prevent your opponent from ever raising their head to take a breath or formulate an independent plan. In the theater of combat, allowing the enemy to seize the initiative is a fatal taboo. The moment you are placed on the defensive, you are dancing to another person's rhythm. Your opponent desires to dominate you just as fiercely as you desire to dominate them. Therefore, you must develop an acute sensitivity to their hidden intentions, anticipating their maneuvers and preemptively neutralizing them. By controlling the framing of the battle, the psychological boundaries within which the conflict occurs, you ensure that every action they take, even their most aggressive strikes, ultimately plays directly into your hands. This profound principle of forcing the dynamic was brilliantly executed in the golden age of Hollywood by the legendary performer Mae West. In 1932, Paramount Pictures began production on a gangster film intended to possess a unique comedic edge. The producers, fearing a lack of genuine humor in the cast, took a considerable risk by hiring West. At 39, she was considered somewhat old for a film debut, and her reputation as a bawdy, highly aggressive stage actress made her a volatile element. Yet the studio offered her a lucrative contract, assuming that the sheer weight of the Hollywood system and the handsome paycheck would easily keep her obedient and contained. Upon arriving, West immediately surveyed the terrain and realized the dynamic was entirely skewed against her. She was a minor player in a major production, handed a script with flat, uninspired dialogue that would effectively ruin her natural, charismatic appeal. When she requested the unprecedented privilege of rewriting her own lines, the studio executives flatly refused. They were seasoned veterans at managing temperamental actresses. Yielding to her demands would establish a dangerous precedent and upend their absolute authority. They assumed she would throw a predictable tantrum and eventually submit to their will. West, however, understood that engaging in a direct, emotional argument with the executives would be fighting on their terms. Instead, she radically altered the stakes. During a dinner designed by the studio boss to cajole and placate her, she reached into her purse, extracted a check for the entirety of her massive earnings thus far, and calmly handed it back. She politely thanked him for the opportunity and announced she was leaving for New York the following morning. The studio boss was caught completely off balance by demonstrating a willing disregard for the money and a total lack of fear regarding her Hollywood future. She shattered his assumptions. She had taken the ultimate initiative, proving she could not be bought, bullied, or intimidated. Faced with the sudden collapse of their production and the terrifying realization that they possessed absolutely no leverage over her, the studio capitulated. They granted her the power to rewrite her role, and the dynamic of her entire film career was permanently established on her own unyielding terms. To master this forcing strategy, you must recognize that true control is rarely achieved through overt aggression or loud demands. Those tactics merely breed resistance and reveal your own internal insecurities. Instead, control is achieved by manipulating the psychological environment of your adversary. You must learn to push their emotional buttons, sparking their pride, their impatience, or their deep-seated fears, compelling them to act rashly and make unforced errors. You bait them into making the first move, but only when that move leads them directly into your carefully laid trap. There are times when the most effective forcing strategy is to cultivate a deliberate illusion of weakness. By appearing compliant and submitting to their apparent authority, you encourage the enemy to lower their guard and advance with unwarranted, arrogant confidence. They believe they are dictating the pace, but in reality, they are marching blindly down the narrow corridor you have secretly constructed for them. You determine what is discussed, you establish the moral high ground, and you set the invisible deadlines. When you control the overall direction and framing of the relationship, you cease to be a mere participant in a struggle and become the silent, omnipotent director of the entire play. Chapter 16. Hit them where it hurts. The center of gravity strategy. In the sprawling architecture of any conflict, whether it is a physical war, a corporate struggle, or a deeply personal rivalry, We often become mesmerized by the sheer size and complexity of our adversary. We look at their massive armies, their boundless wealth, or their sprawling influence, and we feel an overwhelming sense of dread. The natural instinct is to attack this intimidating mass at its edges, attempting to chip away at their power piece by piece in a war of attrition. But this is a fatal miscalculation. Every structure, no matter how imposing or seemingly invincible, is ultimately held together by a single, foundational pillar. There is a singular source from which all their power, morale, and momentum flows. In military terminology, this is known as the center of gravity. If you waste your energy attacking the extremities, the enemy will simply absorb the damage and regenerate. But if you can identify and shatter this center of gravity, the entire massive edifice will collapse under its own weight. The true art of strategy is the ruthless, surgical pursuit of this vital organ. In the year 218 BC, the Roman Republic faced the most terrifying existential threat in its history. Hannibal Barca, the brilliant Carthaginian general, had achieved the impossible by crossing the Alps with his army and his war elephants, descending into the Italian peninsula. For over a decade, Hannibal roamed freely across Roman territory, inflicting catastrophic, humiliating defeats upon the Roman legions. The Romans, gripped by panic, attempted every conceivable conventional strategy. They raised massive new armies, they tried to engage him in pitched battles, and they attempted to starve him out. Yet Hannibal remained unconquerable on the battlefield. The Roman leadership was paralyzed, entirely focused on the terrifying physical presence of Hannibal's army ravaging their homeland. They were fighting the periphery, reacting to the immediate threat, and bleeding themselves dry in the process. It was a young, visionary Roman commander named Scipio who finally broke this mesmerizing spell. Scipio understood that Hannibal's army, despite its brilliance, was an isolated force. Its center of gravity was not in Italy. It was the political and financial support it received from the Carthaginian capital in North Africa, and the vital supply lines flowing through Spain. Scipio proposed a strategy that sounded like sheer madness to the Roman Senate. Instead of fighting the invincible Hannibal in Italy, Rome should leave a minimal defensive force and launch a massive invasion directly into Spain and Africa. He argued that they must ignore the terrifying symptom and strike directly at the disease. Despite fierce opposition, Scipio was granted command. He struck swiftly into Spain, capturing the vital Carthaginian base of New Carthage in a brilliant surprise attack, permanently severing Hannibal's overland supply route. He then launched his forces directly toward the city of Carthage itself in North Africa. The Carthaginian Senate, terrified by the sudden presence of a Roman army at their gates, panicked. They desperately recalled Hannibal from Italy to defend the homeland. Scipio had achieved without fighting what generations of Roman generals had failed to do with oceans of blood. He forced Hannibal to abandon Italy. When the two legendary commanders finally met on the plains of Zama, Scipio systematically dismantled Hannibal's forces, achieving a total, definitive victory. He won the war because he refused to strike at the enemy's impenetrable shield, choosing instead to plunge his dagger directly into their exposed, beating heart. The mesmerizing power of a formidable opponent often clouds our strategic vision. We become obsessed with the immediate pain they are inflicting upon us, reacting blindly to their strikes. Scipio's genius lay in his supreme emotional detachment. He realized that fighting Hannibal on Hannibal's chosen terrain was a game of endless attrition. By shifting his gaze away from the immediate terror and analyzing the broader geopolitical board, he identified the hidden, fragile thread that sustained the enemy's entire war effort. When he severed that thread, the terrifying giant was instantly rendered powerless. In your own conflicts, you must resist the powerful gravitational pull of the enemy's most obvious strengths. Do not attack their heavily fortified positions. Look past the armor and find the hub that connects the spokes of their power. This concept was formally codified centuries later by the Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, who defined it as the focal point of all power and movement, the singular element upon which everything depends. Discovering this center requires a profound, penetrating psychological and structural analysis of your opponent. Sometimes the center of gravity is entirely physical, a specific supply chain, a bank account, or a crucial piece of infrastructure. If an adversary relies on a massive influx of capital to sustain their aggressive maneuvers, you do not fight their expensive lawyers or their marketing teams. You systematically attack and dismantle their source of funding. Without the financial lifeblood, their entire operation withers and dies. More frequently, however, the center of gravity is human and psychological. It might be the charismatic leader of an opposing organization. If the group's unity and drive depend entirely on the magnetism of one individual, you must isolate, discredit, or remove that person. Without their visionary core, the organization will swiftly devolve into a chaotic, directionless mob. Alternatively, the center of gravity might be a specific alliance. If your enemy draws their confidence and power from a powerful backer or a coalition of supporters, your primary objective must be to drive a wedge between them, sow seeds of distrust, manufacture conflicts of interest, and shatter the alliance. Once the enemy is isolated and stripped of their support system, they become incredibly fragile and easily destroyed. Occasionally, the center of gravity is entirely intangible, an idea, a shared belief, or an unyielding moral conviction. If an enemy fights with a fanatical, self-righteous fervor, you cannot defeat them with brute force alone, as physical suffering will only validate their martyrdom. You must strike at their philosophical core. You must expose the hypocrisy of their leaders, introduce doubt into their rigid belief system, and erode their moral high ground. When an army loses its underlying reason for fighting, its physical weapons become completely useless. Visualize a magnificent, towering arch of stone. It stands for centuries, absorbing the brutal punishment of wind, rain, and earthquakes. You can strike the massive pillars with heavy hammers all day and barely leave a scratch. But at the very top of the arch lies a single, precisely cut keystone. This small stone dictates the geometry and the distribution of weight for the entire massive structure. If you patiently locate this keystone and apply targeted pressure to dislodge it, the entire magnificent arch will violently collapse into a pile of useless rubble. The blow must be directed against the enemy's center of gravity, for it is there that the decision will be reached. While you are ruthlessly hunting for your enemy's center of gravity, you must be acutely, agonizingly aware of your own. You must assume that any intelligent adversary is simultaneously searching for your vital organ. The ultimate strategic defense is to ensure that your center of gravity is completely hidden, constantly shifting, or entirely non-existent. If you rely too heavily on a single individual, a single source of income, or a single tactical maneuver, you are painting a massive target on your own chest. You must decentralize your power, diffuse your resources, and remain incredibly fluid. When the enemy strikes with all their might, expecting to shatter your core, they must find nothing but empty space, leaving them unbalanced, exhausted, and perfectly positioned for your devastating counterattack. Chapter 17. Defeat them in detail. The divide and conquer strategy. When confronting a formidable, unified adversary or a sudden wave of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, the natural human instinct is to feel intimidated and paralyzed into inaction, often waiting in the vain hope that time alone will provide a peaceful solution. However, allowing a large, powerful entity to advance fully concentrated and unified only grants it an irresistible, overwhelming momentum. The superior approach requires taking a calculated risk to meet the advancing force early, deliberately engineering circumstances that force it to divide. The most effective method for splitting an opponent is to boldly occupy the center of the strategic chessboard. This center can be a literal physical location, or it can represent the psychological core of a group, such as the vital levers of power or the support of a crucial ally. By commanding the center, you compel the enemy to splinter into smaller, fractured pieces as they attempt to strike from multiple angles. Once a massive threat is divided, it is transformed into a series of highly manageable parts that can be systematically defeated in detail, paving the way for complete annihilation. This strategic dismantling must also be applied to the psychological bonds that unify an opponent. In colonial America, Samuel Adams initially believed that well-reasoned, logical arguments would be sufficient to persuade the colonists to seek independence from England. After years of failure, he recognized a profound psychological reality. The colonists were bound to England by a deep emotional attachment, viewing the mother country as a necessary protector in a hostile world. Recognizing that logic is useless against emotion, Adams shifted his strategy to attack the joints, the emotional ties connecting the two entities. He orchestrated highly theatrical demonstrations and boycotts, such as the Boston Tea Party, specifically calibrated to infuriate the British and provoke them into rash, tyrannical overreactions. By baiting the parent nation into harsh military responses, he successfully severed the psychological bond of trust, making the colonists feel oppressed rather than protected. You must recognize that the ties holding an enemy together are emotional, and by attacking those specific joints, you divide their minds and render them entirely vulnerable to your influence. The supreme power of this strategy originates from the deepest, most primitive human fears. Early humans, possessing no natural physical armor against predators, compensated for their extreme vulnerability by forming tightly knit groups and tribes. The presence of others offered protection and the reassurance that someone was always watching your back. This primitive reliance on the herd remains fiercely active in the modern human psyche. When an individual is systematically cut off from their group, alienated from their allies, and left entirely unsupported, they are plunged back into an intolerable, primitive terror. By deliberately isolating your opponents, you strip away their psychological armor. The strategy of dividing and conquering capitalizes on this terror. An isolated enemy will almost always overreact, panic, and easily succumb to manipulation or outright destruction. To govern any complex organization or to neutralize a sprawling threat, you must master the art of division and supreme control, a concept perfected by the ancient Romans. After defeating the powerful Latin League, the Romans avoided the trap of either crushing the cities completely or granting them full autonomy. Instead, they broke the confederation apart and treated each city differently, forcing the formerly united allies to fiercely compete against one another for Rome's favor and the privileges of citizenship. You must establish yourself as the absolute center of power, ensuring that those around you find it more advantageous to seek your approval than to form hidden alliances with one another. Like Queen Elizabeth I, who deliberately pitted noble families against each other to prevent any single faction from gaining dominance, or the legendary film director Alfred Hitchcock, who kept every department on his sets slightly isolated and dependent exclusively on his central vision, you must remain the hub around which everything revolves. Before launching a direct assault against a powerful rival, you must covertly drive wedges into their support system. When the Chinese leader Mao Zedong suspected his seemingly loyal Minister of Defense, Lin Biao, of plotting a takeover, Mao did not attack him frontally, which would have sparked a destructive political war. Instead, Mao maintained a public facade of warm support while silently and methodically demoting Lin's key allies within the military. By encouraging Lin to vocalize extreme ideas that proved highly unpopular, Mao further alienated the minister from his foundation. Recognizing that his power base had evaporated, a panicked and isolated Lin resorted to a desperate coup that ultimately sealed his own doom. Whenever you face an adversary, you must search for the invisible threads that connect them to their power, their allies, and their confidence. Sever those threads one by one, and the formidable enemy will inevitably collapse under the heavy weight of their own terrifying isolation. Chapter 18, the author explores the turning strategy, which focuses on exposing and attacking an opponent's soft flank. Frontal assaults against an enemy's strongest defenses are often costly, exhausting, and predictable, as opponents naturally expect to be attacked where they are most heavily fortified. Instead of meeting force with force, a strategic leader maneuvers around the main line of resistance to target vulnerabilities where the adversary is least prepared or protected. By striking at these physical or psychological blind spots, you force the opponent to abandon their secure positions, turn, and react to your initiative under immense pressure. This sudden shift destroys their equilibrium and forces them to fight on unfamiliar terrain or address unpredicted crises, making your victory far more decisive and economical. Chapter 19. The author explores the annihilation strategy, which centers on the tactical concept of envelopment. Rather than engaging in a standard head-on collision where an opponent can easily retreat or regroup, a strategist seeks to completely surround the adversary. This approach involves systematically cutting off their avenues of escape, severing their access to resources, and isolating them from outside alliances or support. By closing in from all sides, the strategist applies immense physical and psychological pressure. The opponent is left feeling entirely trapped and paralyzed, realizing there is no safe haven or operational freedom left. This total containment effectively shatters the enemy's will to fight, accelerating their collapse and ensuring a definitive, comprehensive victory. Chapter 20. Maneuver them into weakness, the ripening for the sickle strategy. In this chapter, the narrative explores the profound concept of defeating an opponent before the actual battle even begins. The metaphor of ripening for the sickle suggests that a master strategist does not expend massive amounts of energy hacking away at a strong, deeply rooted tree. Rather, they wait for the fruit to ripen and fall, or they subtly alter the environment until the enemy is so weakened that the final blow is merely a formality, the swift swing of a sickle harvesting what is already defeated. The core philosophy here is that direct conflict against a fully prepared, rested, and confident adversary is a failure of strategic imagination. Instead, the strategist's primary work is done in the shadows, focusing on maneuver rather than immediate combat. This involves subtly orchestrating circumstances to place the opponent in an untenable dilemma. You might lure them into unfavorable terrain where their natural advantages are neutralized, or manipulate their environment to stretch their supply lines to the breaking point. Psychologically, the strategy focuses on inducing internal friction and emotional exhaustion. By feeding the enemy deceptive information, baiting their pride, or constantly shifting the parameters of the conflict, you force them into a state of perpetual anxiety and reactive decision-making. They burn through their physical and mental reserves simply trying to figure out where the real threat lies. The ultimate goal of this strategy is to create a scenario where the enemy defeats themselves through their own overextension, frustration, and panic. By the time you finally choose to engage them directly, they are already demoralized, physically drained, and structurally compromised. The engagement is no longer a contest of equals, but a calculated execution of an opponent who has been methodically maneuvered into a state of absolute weakness. Chapter 21. Negotiate while advancing. The diplomatic war strategy. There is a dangerous, deeply ingrained societal illusion that war and peace are mutually exclusive states. We are conditioned to believe that when adversaries finally sit down at the negotiating table, the conflict is paused, weapons are lowered, and a spirit of genuine compromise takes over. The master strategist recognizes this as a fatal psychological vulnerability. In the brutal reality of conflict, negotiation is not the end of the war. It is simply another weapon in your arsenal, an extension of combat by other means. This is the essence of the diplomatic war strategy. You must continue to aggressively advance your position, secure your objectives, and build your leverage while hiding behind the comforting, civilized facade of peace talks. The ancient Greek city-states learned this lesson the hard way at the hands of Philip II of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great. The Greeks were fiercely independent but exhausted by decades of internal warfare. Philip, aiming to conquer them all, recognized that a massive, direct military invasion would unite the Greeks against him. Instead, he employed a brilliant, insidious diplomatic strategy. He constantly proposed treaties, offered alliances, and negotiated peace settlements. Desperate for stability, the Greek city-states eagerly accepted his diplomatic overtures, lowering their guards and demobilizing their armies. However, Philip never stopped moving. While the Greek politicians endlessly debated the terms of his treaties, Philip used the bought time to modernize his phalanx formations, secure vital gold mines, and quietly position his forces at strategic choke points. By the time the Greeks realized that Philip's peace was merely a cover for systemic expansion, it was too late. He had already surrounded them, and their subjugation was virtually effortless. Philip conquered Greece not primarily through bloodshed, but through the weaponization of diplomacy. To effectively execute this strategy in your own negotiations, whether in business, politics, or personal disputes, you must fundamentally alter your perception of the negotiating table. First, use negotiations to buy precious time. When you are in a weakened position or need to consolidate your resources, initiate talks. The very act of negotiating slows the enemy's momentum. It forces them to pause their aggressive actions while they wait for your proposals. You use this borrowed time to regroup, strengthen your alliances, and prepare for the next phase of the conflict. Second, use the table for intelligence gathering. When an opponent sits down to negotiate, they are inevitably forced to reveal their hand. Through their demands and concessions, you can map their psychological landscape. You discover what they value most, what they fear losing, and where their absolute bottom line is located. They believe they are bargaining. In reality, they are handing you the exact blueprint of their vulnerabilities. Third, exploit the desire for harmony. Human beings have a profound psychological need to resolve tension. We want to believe the conflict is ending. You can manipulate this desire by offering minor cosmetic concessions that cost you nothing but make the opponent feel victorious. While they are distracted by these symbolic wins, you secure the tangible structural advantages in the background. The ultimate rule of diplomatic war is that your words and your actions must be entirely disconnected. Speak the language of compromise, smile and appear perfectly reasonable, but never halt your forward momentum. A treaty or an agreement is only as strong as the leverage enforcing it. If you stop fighting the moment you start talking, you surrender your power. Chapter 22. Know how to end things. The exit strategy. Human beings are naturally drawn to the thrill of the beginning. When we launch a new project, enter a negotiation, or start a conflict, our minds are flooded with adrenaline and visions of glorious success. Starting is remarkably easy. Ending, however, is an agonizingly difficult art. In the theater of strategy, you are ultimately judged not by the brilliance of your opening maneuvers, but by the exact manner in which you conclude the campaign. A spectacular, sweeping victory can be entirely negated if the war drags on too long, draining your resources and breeding a bitter, endless insurgency. The master strategist understands that an exit strategy is not an afterthought. It is the very first thing that must be defined before a single step is taken. To understand the profound discipline required to execute a perfect exit, we must look to the 19th century Prussian statesman Otto von Bismarck. In 1866, Prussia went to war with the Austrian Empire to settle the question of who would dominate the fractured German states. The Prussian military machine, highly modernized and brilliantly led, crushed the Austrian forces at the massive Battle of Königgrätz. Following this devastating victory, the Prussian king, his generals, and the public were intoxicated by their success. Driven by pride and the intoxicating momentum of victory, they demanded that the army march directly into Vienna, humiliate the Austrian emperor, and annex vast swathes of territory. They wanted total crushing domination. Bismarck, however, was a grand strategist who possessed an icy, almost terrifying emotional detachment. He recognized that marching on Vienna would be a catastrophic mistake. It would irreparably humiliate the Austrians, guaranteeing a future war of vengeance. Furthermore, a protracted occupation would inevitably draw the hostile gaze of France and Russia, who would intervene to stop Prussian expansion. Bismarck's ultimate, predefined objective was simply to remove Austrian influence from German affairs, not to destroy the Austrian Empire. Despite being branded a traitor and a coward by his own king and his military elite, Bismarck furiously dug in his heels. He threatened to resign and even implied suicide if they did not halt the advance. He forced the king to offer Austria incredibly lenient peace terms. By stopping at the exact moment of peak leverage, Bismarck secured his primary objective, avoided a sprawling European war, and even left the door open for an eventual alliance with Austria years later. He won the war precisely because he knew exactly when and how to end it. The most fatal disease in strategy is the sunk cost fallacy paired with the intoxication of momentum. When you are losing, pride and the fear of admitting defeat convince you to pour more money, time, and emotion into a doomed enterprise. You hallucinate that just one more push will turn the tide. When you are winning, greed and arrogance convince you that you can achieve even more, causing you to push past your original objectives and overextend your forces. To master the exit strategy, you must ruthlessly eradicate these emotional impulses. First, define your victory condition in advance. Before you enter any conflict or negotiation, you must determine the exact, specific outcome you need to achieve. The moment you secure that objective, you must stop. Do not allow sudden success to inflate your goals. Grab your winnings and immediately leave the table. Second, learn to cut your losses. If a venture is failing, recognize that your ego is the only thing keeping you attached to it. A strategic withdrawal is not a failure. It is the preservation of your vital energy and capital for a battle you can actually win. There is no shame in abandoning a sinking ship. The only shame is going down with it out of sheer stubbornness. Finally, do not seek total annihilation unless absolutely necessary. If you utterly humiliate an opponent, you leave them with nothing to lose and a burning, multi-generational desire for revenge. A perfect exit often involves leaving the defeated adversary with a sliver of dignity or a small concession. It costs you nothing, but it neutralizes their desire to fight you again in the future. The end of a conflict is the most delicate and dangerous phase. Secure your objectives, control your ego, and exit the battlefield while you still hold the power to dictate the terms. Chapter 23. Weave a seamless blend of fact and fiction. Misperception strategies. From early childhood, we are taught that honesty is the ultimate moral virtue, and deception is an unforgivable sin. In the ruthless theater of strategy, however, absolute transparency is a fatal vulnerability. If your adversary can accurately read your intentions, your capabilities, and your true desires, you have already surrendered the initiative. You become entirely predictable, and predictability is the precursor to destruction. To survive and conquer in hostile environments, you must master the art of misperception. This does not mean becoming a clumsy, habitual liar. A crude lie is easily detected, and once discovered, it permanently shatters your credibility. The master strategist employs a far more sophisticated weapon, the seamless, impenetrable blending of fact and fiction. You must construct a false reality that is so heavily reinforced with verifiable truths that the enemy cannot possibly separate the solid ground from the quicksand. The Phantom Army Tactic, the ultimate historical masterclass in misperception, was orchestrated by the Allies in the months preceding the D-Day invasion of 1944. The overarching strategic objective was to invade Nazi-occupied Europe through the beaches of Normandy. However, Hitler and the German High Command heavily fortified the entire coastline. If the Germans knew the exact location of the invasion, they would concentrate their panzer divisions and push the Allied forces back into the sea. The Allies had to convince Hitler that the invasion was coming somewhere else. They initiated a colossal deception campaign known as Operation Fortitude. The genius of Fortitude was that it played directly into what the Germans already believed. The most logical, geographically sound place to invade France was the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. Hitler expected the attack there. Instead of trying to convince him of something wildly improbable, the Allies simply fed his own confirmation bias. They created a massive, entirely fictitious military force, the 1st US Army Group, FUSAC, placing it under the command of General George S. Patton, the commander the Germans feared most. They stationed this phantom army in southeastern England, directly across from Calais. But they did not just spread rumors, they built a physical, verifiable illusion. They constructed hundreds of inflatable rubber tanks, wooden artillery pieces, and empty canvas tents that looked incredibly real to German reconnaissance planes flying high overhead. More importantly, the Allies wove a brilliant tapestry of true and false intelligence. They maintained an overwhelming volume of fake radio traffic for FUSAC, perfectly mimicking the communication patterns of a massive army preparing for war. They utilized brilliant double agents, most notably a Spaniard codenamed Garbo, who fed German intelligence a steady stream of highly accurate, verifiable information about minor Allied troop movements, the facts, mixed seamlessly with desperate warnings that the main attack was coming at Calais, the fiction. The deception was so flawlessly constructed that even weeks after the Allies actually landed at Normandy, Hitler adamantly refused to send his reserve panzer divisions to the beaches. He remained absolutely paralyzed, convinced by the seamless blend of facts and fake tanks that Normandy was merely a diversion, and Patton's Phantom Army was about to launch the real invasion at Calais. The Germans were defeated not just by superior firepower on the beaches, but by a brilliantly woven psychological illusion that hijacked their own expectations. Interpretation. The human mind is a meaning-making machine. We do not process every piece of information objectively. Instead, we actively search for data that confirms what we already suspect or desire to be true. When you understand this cognitive vulnerability, you can weaponize it. The Germans wanted to believe the attack was coming at Calais because it made logical sense to them. The Allies did not try to change Hitler's mind. They eagerly supplied the proof his mind was already desperately looking for. When you attempt to deceive an opponent, the most common mistake is creating a fabrication out of whole cloth. If your story has no anchor in reality, it will eventually float away under scrutiny. The grand strategist builds their deception upon a foundation of absolute, undeniable truth. You give the enemy a piece of genuine intelligence, a real concession, or a verified fact. This builds trust and lowers their defenses. Once they swallow the truth, they will blindly swallow the poison pill of fiction hidden inside it. Keys to warfare. To deploy the strategy of misperception effectively, you must control the information environment surrounding your adversary. First, play upon their expectations and desires. If your opponent is paranoid, feed their paranoia with ambiguous shadows. If they are greedy, offer them an illusion of easy profit. People are the easiest to deceive when the deception perfectly aligns with their deepest wishes or their worst fears. Second, use a screen of truth. Confess to a minor weakness, reveal a secondary, unimportant plan. By being aggressively honest about things that do not actually matter to your grand strategy, you establish a reputation for transparency. Your opponent will naturally assume that someone so forthcoming about their flaws could not possibly be orchestrating a massive deception. Third, embrace ambiguity over direct falsehoods. A direct lie is brittle. It can be broken by a single contradictory fact. Ambiguity, however, is flexible. Send mixed signals, act unpredictably, let rumors circulate without confirming or denying them. When the enemy is forced to guess your intentions, they will exhaust their mental energy trying to solve the puzzle, often constructing a false narrative that is far more damaging to them than anything you could have invented. The ultimate goal of misperception is not merely to hide your actions, but to actively guide the enemy's mind down a dark alley of their own making. You become the architect of their reality, ensuring that by the time they finally see the truth, they are already entirely surrounded by it. Chapter 24. Take the line of least expectation. The ordinary, extraordinary strategy. The human mind is fundamentally a pattern recognition machine. We are biologically wired to seek out routines, consistencies, and predictable behaviors in our environment because predictability equates to safety. In the realm of conflict, however, predictability is a fatal weakness. If your adversary can comfortably anticipate your next move, your favorite tactics, or your standard reaction to stress, they can easily construct a trap designed specifically for you. To achieve total strategic dominance, you must weaponize this human reliance on patterns. You must master the delicate, devastating art of the ordinary, extraordinary strategy. This concept is rooted deeply in ancient Chinese military philosophy, specifically in the concepts of zheng, the ordinary, orthodox, or expected, and qi, the extraordinary, unorthodox, or unexpected. The zheng and qi tactic. In classical warfare, a commander does not simply hurl his entire army at the enemy in a chaotic frenzy. Instead, he divides his forces. The zheng force is deployed directly in front of the enemy. It operates exactly as expected, engaging in a conventional, predictable manner. Its sole purpose is to capture the enemy's attention, lock them into a familiar rhythm, and make them feel secure in their understanding of the battlefield. The enemy believes they are fighting a standard, ordinary war, but while the enemy is entirely fixated on the zheng, the commander covertly maneuvers the qi force. The qi is the extraordinary element. It moves through the shadows, takes the impossible route, or strikes from an angle the enemy deems secure. Because the enemy's mental and physical resources are completely absorbed by the ordinary threat in front of them, the sudden violent impact of the extraordinary threat from the flank or the rear completely shatters their psychological resolve. The ordinary force fixes them in place. The extraordinary force delivers the killing blow. Interpretation. When we engage in conflicts, whether in corporate negotiations, market competition, or personal disputes, we naturally fall into habits. We use the same rhetorical arguments, rely on the same business models, and respond to provocations with the same emotional outbursts. We become walking cliches. The master strategist consciously controls their outward behavior to manipulate the expectations of their opponent. If you wish to destroy a rival, do not begin by acting radically or aggressively, as this instantly raises their defenses. Instead, feed them the zheng, act utterly ordinary, be polite, follow the established rules, and make the exact moves they expect a rational person to make. Let them grow bored and complacent. Let them believe they have you completely figured out. Once they are lulled into this psychological slumber, you unleash the qi. You execute a maneuver that completely defies their logic and violates the established rules of the engagement. Because they were conditioned to expect the ordinary, the sudden introduction of the extraordinary induces profound cognitive shock. They will panic, their defensive architecture will crumble, and they will make fatal, unforced errors. Keys to warfare. To execute the line of least expectation, you must cultivate a profound level of self-awareness and control. First, you must understand how others perceive you. What is your established pattern? Are you known for being cautious, aggressive, compromising? Once you identify the box your opponent has placed you in, you possess the power to step outside of it. If you are known for caution, a sudden act of extreme, calculated boldness will paralyze your enemy. If you are known for aggression, a sudden display of passive, yielding behavior will deeply disorient them. Second, you must establish the pattern before you break it. The extraordinary only possesses power if it is contrasted against the ordinary. If you are constantly chaotic and unpredictable, you merely exhaust yourself and alienate your allies. You must deliberately perform a series of mundane, predictable actions to set the metronome. Only when the enemy is nodding along to your rhythm do you suddenly change the tempo. Finally, never repeat your extraordinary maneuver. The moment an unorthodox tactic is used, it instantly becomes orthodox. If a surprise attack is successful, the enemy will inevitably prepare for it the next time. The grand strategist is a shapeshifter, possessing an endless repertoire of unexpected maneuvers, ensuring that the adversary is perpetually fighting the ghosts of the past rather than the reality of the present. Chapter 25. Occupy the moral high ground. The righteous strategy. In the cold, calculating realm of strategy, we frequently make the mistake of viewing conflict purely as a clash of physical forces, financial resources, or tactical maneuvers. We ignore the supreme invisible force that actually dictates human behavior, the deep-seated psychological need to feel justified. Human beings are inherently moral creatures. We cannot sustain aggressive action, endure prolonged suffering, or commit acts of violence unless we possess a profound internal conviction that our cause is just and righteous. If an army or an organization believes it is fighting for a noble purpose, it will fight with fanatical, unbreakable zeal. Conversely, if an adversary can be made to feel guilty, hypocritical, or cast as the unjust aggressor, their internal resolve will crumble. The strategic warrior understands that morality is not just a philosophical concept, it is a highly effective, deployable weapon. By deliberately occupying the moral high ground, you instantly multiply your own power while paralyzing your opponent with the weight of public condemnation and internal doubt. The aggressor tactic. To grasp the sheer, unassailable power of the moral high ground, one must study the political genius of Abraham Lincoln during the agonizing weeks preceding the American Civil War. In the spring of 1861, the United States was tearing itself apart. Several southern states had already seceded, forming the Confederacy, and they were aggressively seizing federal forts across the South. The most critical flashpoint was Fort Sumter, a federal stronghold located squarely in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. The fort was surrounded by hostile Confederate cannons and was rapidly running out of food and supplies. Lincoln faced an impossible, paralyzing dilemma. If he surrendered the fort to the Confederacy, he would be acknowledging their sovereignty, projecting weakness, and entirely legitimizing the rebellion in the eyes of the world and his own deeply divided northern public. However, if he sent heavily armed Union warships to blast their way into the harbor to resupply the fort, Lincoln would be the one initiating a bloody civil war. He would be cast as the tyrannical aggressor, unifying the entire South against him and alienating the crucial border states that had not yet seceded. Lincoln required a war to preserve the Union, but strategically, he absolutely could not be the one to start it. Instead of choosing between two disastrous options, Lincoln orchestrated a brilliant maneuver to shift the moral burden entirely onto the Confederacy. He publicly and officially notified the governor of South Carolina that he was sending a completely unarmed expedition to Fort Sumter. Its sole stated purpose was to deliver bread to a few brave and hungry men. He explicitly promised that no arms, troops, or ammunition would be landed unless the fort was fired upon. This simple, seemingly humane act placed the Confederate leadership in a devastating psychological trap. Lincoln had claimed the absolute moral high ground. He was merely feeding starving soldiers. The Confederate President Jefferson Davis was forced into a reactive, highly emotional decision. Driven by pride and the desperate need to assert Southern sovereignty, Davis ordered his cannons to open fire on the fort before the relief ships even arrived. The strategy was a masterful success. By maneuvering the South into firing the first shot against a purely defensive humanitarian mission, Lincoln instantly unified a previously fractured and hesitant Northern public in a wave of righteous, patriotic fury. He secured the absolute moral high ground, framing the Confederacy as unprovoked, violent aggressors. That initial burst of righteous indignation sustained the Union through 4 years of unimaginable bloodshed. Lincoln did not just win the opening political maneuver, he won the narrative of the entire war before it even truly began. Interpretation. The moral high ground is the ultimate strategic fortress. When you occupy it, every action you take is viewed through the lens of justice and necessity, while every action your opponent takes is viewed through the lens of malice and tyranny. If you initiate an attack out of visible anger, greed, or the desire for dominance, you instantly trigger the immune system of the surrounding community. Onlookers will naturally sympathize with the victim, and your allies will quietly distance themselves from your toxic aggression. However, if you can deliberately maneuver your adversary into losing their temper and striking first, especially if their strike is disproportionate or seemingly unprovoked, you harness the immense power of the victim dynamic. You become the aggrieved party, fighting only out of noble self-defense. Keys to warfare. To effectively weaponize righteousness, you must cultivate a profound understanding of public perception and the emotional triggers of your adversary. First, you must master the art of framing. In any dispute, the side that successfully defines the terms of the conflict usually wins. You must constantly frame your actions not as a pursuit of power, but as a defense of universal values: fairness, liberty, the protection of the weak, or the upholding of established agreements. Your opponent must be framed not as a competitor, but as an enemy of those values. Second, expose the enemy's hypocrisy. There is nothing more destructive to an opponent's morale than having their own stated ideals used against them. If your adversary claims to champion transparency, you must publicly and relentlessly force them into situations where they act with secrecy. When their actions contradict their stated morals, they lose the support of their followers and the psychological high ground. They begin to doubt themselves. Third, never appear as the unprovoked aggressor. Even if you must initiate hostilities, you must create a pretext that justifies the action. You must provoke the enemy into a minor transgression, allowing you to respond with justified and overwhelming force. Bait them into overreacting. An opponent who is angry and frustrated will almost always strike blindly, granting you the magnificent gift of appearing as the rational, righteous defender. Ultimately, occupying the moral high ground requires intense emotional discipline. You cannot afford to throw tantrums or seek petty vengeance. You must project an aura of calm, principled endurance, allowing the enemy to hang themselves with the rope of their own undisciplined aggression. Chapter 26. Deny them targets. The strategy of the void. The strategy of the void revolves around the philosophy of extreme formlessness and asymmetrical conflict. When facing a massively superior or rigidly structured opponent, presenting a static, conventional target is a recipe for rapid defeat. Instead of meeting force with force, this approach dictates that you must become like vapor, impossible to grasp, constantly in motion and entirely unpredictable. By refusing to hold physical territory or engage in traditional battles, you deny the enemy the satisfaction of a decisive victory. You strike quickly at their vulnerable peripheries and immediately melt back into the shadows. The underlying psychology of this strategy is particularly devastating. A conventional powerhouse relies on striking something solid to validate its strength and maintain its morale. When an aggressive opponent repeatedly punches into the void, their kinetic energy is wasted. This induces profound psychological exhaustion, paranoia, and frustration. In a way that echoes Stoic adaptability, this strategy uses the enemy's own massive momentum and rigid expectations as the very weapons that destroy them, simply by refusing to be where they expect you to be. Key philosophical takeaways. The power of emptiness. True strength in a heavily mismatched conflict comes from what you lack: a center of gravity, a fixed base, or a rigid hierarchy. Psychological attrition. The goal is not to destroy the enemy's army physically in one blow, but to slowly erode their will to fight by making the conflict feel endless and unwinnable. Total fluidity. Success requires a mindset completely detached from ego and the traditional desire to hold your ground. You must be willing to retreat constantly to maintain your ultimate freedom of maneuver. Chapter 27. Seem to work for the interests of others. The alliance strategy. This chapter explores the highly pragmatic and often cynical nature of forging alliances. It warns against the dangerous illusion of relying on emotional bonds, loyalty, or past gratitude when seeking assistance from others. In the strategic realm, the ultimate and only reliable glue for any partnership is pure, unadulterated self-interest. To secure powerful allies, a strategist must skillfully frame their own objectives so that they appear to directly benefit the other party. By publicly championing a seemingly shared cause or mutual enemy, you effectively mask your true independent ambitions. The text emphasizes the utility of these temporary partnerships. You can use allies to expand your reach, force them to absorb the heaviest risks, or let them handle the politically unpleasant tasks on your behalf. Crucially, a master strategist maintains profound emotional detachment, recognizing that alliances are merely tools of convenience. They must be carefully managed, constantly evaluated, and ultimately discarded or renegotiated the exact moment they cease to serve your overarching goals. Chapter 28. Give your rivals enough rope to hang themselves. The one-upmanship strategy. In the delicate dance of human conflict, your greatest weapon is often the uncontrollable ego of your adversary. When we are attacked or challenged by a bitter rival, our immediate primal instinct is to strike back with equal or greater force. However, engaging in a direct, escalating cycle of one-upmanship is exhausting and makes you look just as petty and vindictive as your opponent. The master strategist employs a far more elegant and devastating approach, the psychological martial art of using the enemy's own momentum against them. Instead of actively trying to destroy your rival, you subtly provoke their worst tendencies, their arrogance, their greed, or their explosive temper, and then step back, allowing them to overextend and self-destruct in spectacular fashion. The core philosophy. If you try to hang your opponent, you get your hands dirty and invite retaliation from their allies. But if you simply hand them the rope, they will often tie the noose themselves. By playing the innocent bystander or the passive victim, you create a vacuum. A rival driven by insecurity or hubris will naturally rush to fill that vacuum, pushing their boundaries, making increasingly outrageous demands, and alienating everyone around them. Key execution tactics. The art of yielding. When your rival acts aggressively, do not block them. Yield. Agree with them in a way that encourages them to go even further. Their initial success will inflate their ego, blinding them to the reality that they are marching onto thin ice. Subtle provocation. You must learn the exact pressure points of your enemy. A well-placed subtle slight can trigger a massive, disproportionate emotional reaction from them. When they lose their temper publicly, they destroy their own reputation while you remain perfectly calm and composed. The trap of perfection. If a rival is obsessed with proving their superiority, give them a task or a platform that is impossible to manage. Let them claim the spotlight. When the inevitable failure occurs, the weight of the collapse falls entirely on their shoulders. Ultimately, this strategy requires profound patience and the suppression of your own ego. You must be willing to look temporarily weak or subservient to guarantee that your rival's ultimate downfall is entirely of their own making. Chapter 29. Take small bites. The fait accompli strategy. In the pursuit of power, territory, or influence, our greatest enemy is often our own impatience. When we reveal the full scale of our grand ambitions and attempt to seize our ultimate prize all at once, we instantly trigger the defensive alarms of everyone around us. Massive, sudden grabs for power unify our enemies, provoke fierce resistance, and often result in total defeat. The master strategist, however, understands the psychological vulnerability of incrementalism. If you take what you want in tiny, almost imperceptible bites, no single action will seem significant enough to provoke a full-scale war. By the time your adversaries realize the cumulative scale of your conquest, the balance of power has completely shifted. You have already won, and the new reality is a fait accompli, an established fact that is far too costly for them to reverse. The core philosophy. This approach is frequently referred to in political and military science as salami tactics. If you demand the entire salami, you will be met with a violent refusal. But if you ask for just one paper-thin slice, it seems unreasonable for your opponent to fight you over it. You secure that slice, wait for the tension to dissipate, and then take another. The strategy relies heavily on the human tendency toward apathy and the desire to avoid conflict. People generally do not want to endure the exhaustion and risk of a fight unless they feel their core survival is immediately threatened. By keeping your actions below their threshold of pain and outrage, you pacify their defensive instincts. Key execution tactics. The art of the micro-objective. Break your grand strategy down into the smallest possible components. Never announce your final destination. Let each small bite appear as an isolated, minor adjustment rather than a step in a massive campaign. Act first, negotiate later. The essence of the fait accompli is speed and quiet execution. Do not ask for permission, as that invites debate and resistance. Simply take the small bite. When the opponent eventually protests, you can apologize, offer minor concessions, and engage in lengthy negotiations, all while firmly holding onto the ground you just took. Camouflage your ambition. As you accumulate these small victories, you must aggressively downplay your growing power. Appear humble, non-threatening, and satisfied with your current lot. If your rivals do not perceive a pattern in your minor acquisitions, they will remain asleep until it is entirely too late. Ultimately, taking small bites requires immense emotional discipline. You must suppress your ego's desire for a sudden, glorious victory and embrace the quiet, unglamorous, but unstoppable mathematics of gradual accumulation. Chapter 30. Penetrate their minds. Communication strategies. In our daily lives, we operate under a massive delusion regarding communication. We believe that the primary purpose of speaking or writing is to express our inner thoughts, our feelings, and our truth. However, in the realm of strategy and influence, communication is not an act of self-expression. It is a tactical weapon. Its sole purpose is to penetrate the defensive walls of your target's mind and plant a seed that will eventually grow into the exact action you desire. The greatest barrier to this is human defensiveness. The moment you attempt to directly persuade, argue with, or lecture someone, their intellectual armor goes up. They instantly recognize that you are trying to change their mind or alter their behavior, and they will stubbornly resist you out of pure pride. To achieve true influence, your communication must become a Trojan horse, an idea wrapped in an appealing, non-threatening package that slips silently past the guards. The core philosophy. A master strategist never approaches the front gate of a person's mind. They use the indirect approach. Instead of telling someone what to think, you arrange the information so that they arrive at the conclusion entirely on their own. When a person believes an idea was generated by their own intellect, they will defend it fiercely. Key execution tactics. The power of the oblique. When attempting to convey complex psychological or philosophical concepts, perhaps to an audience listening to an audio format or a summary, direct academic lecturing often fails to hold attention. The listener's cognitive defenses go up and they disengage. The master communicator uses the intimacy of narrative and storytelling to bypass these walls. You wrap the heavy philosophical lesson inside a highly engaging, relatable narrative. They absorb the lesson because they were distracted by the story. Visual and visceral hooks. Words are often weak and easily ignored in a saturated environment. Before you can even deliver your message, you must arrest their attention. The initial point of contact, much like a carefully crafted visual thumbnail or a provocative title, must not merely summarize the content. It must instantly penetrate the viewer's mind by posing a paradox, attacking a common assumption, or triggering deep curiosity. It must force them to stop scrolling and engage. Speak their language, not yours. The most common mistake in communication is focusing on what you want to say. You must ruthlessly analyze your audience's self-interest. What do they fear? What do they secretly desire? You must translate your objective into the language of their needs. If you want them to take an action, do not explain how it benefits you. Explain how it miraculously solves their most pressing, unspoken problem. The action communication. Sometimes the most devastating communication involves no words at all. A sudden, bold action, a calculated silence, or a deliberate withdrawal can send a shockwave through an opponent's mind that no speech could ever achieve. Actions demonstrate power, whereas words merely claim it. Ultimately, strategic communication requires profound empathy mixed with absolute detachment. You must understand exactly how the other person's mind operates, not to sympathize with them, but to map the hidden corridors through which you can seamlessly insert your influence. Chapter 31. Destroy from within. The inner front strategy. When facing an adversary who is deeply entrenched, heavily fortified, or overwhelmingly superior in direct confrontation, launching a frontal assault is not just foolish, it is suicidal. A strong enemy expects an attack from the outside. Their walls are thick, their guards are alert, and external pressure only serves to unite them, giving them a clear, visible target to rally against. To defeat an impenetrable opponent, you must entirely abandon the concept of an external war. You must shift the battlefield to the one place they are completely vulnerable, the inner front. The master strategist understands that the most destructive force in the universe is not an invading army, but a virus. A virus does not batter down the doors of a host cell. It perfectly mimics the cell's own proteins, slips silently past the outer defenses, and inserts itself into the very core of the organism. Once inside, it quietly rewires the host's internal machinery, forcing the entity to destroy itself from the inside out. This is the essence of the inner front strategy: infiltration, subversion, and the invisible cultivation of ruin. The psychology of the fifth column. The term fifth column originated during the Spanish Civil War. When Nationalist General Emilio Mola was marching on the Republican-held city of Madrid, he boldly declared that he had 4 columns of troops converging on the city from the outside. However, he stated that it was his fifth column. the secret sympathizers, spies, and saboteurs who were already living peacefully inside the city walls, who would actually secure the victory. The profound psychological power of the inner front strategy relies on human paranoia. When an organization is attacked from the outside, its members bond together in mutual defense. But when an organization realizes it is bleeding from the inside, absolute terror takes hold. Trust evaporates. Leaders begin to suspect their own lieutenants. Factions form, and the group exhausts its vital energy hunting for the invisible traitor. By merely planting the seeds of internal division, you force the enemy to do your destructive work for you. Key execution tactics. To successfully infiltrate and destroy from within, you must possess the emotional control of a master actor. You cannot afford a single slip of the mask. The perfect friend. To gain entry into your rival's inner circle, you must appear completely non-threatening. You must be the most helpful, agreeable, and loyal subordinate or ally they have. Flatter their ego, take on the tedious tasks they despise, and make yourself utterly indispensable. The most dangerous enemy is always the one who has successfully convinced you that they are your most devoted friend. Invisible friction. Once you have secured their trust and are safely inside the walls, do not launch a sudden, overt attack. Your goal is subversion. Quietly spread subtle rumors, praise one faction while subtly undermining another, feed the leader's existing insecurities. Your objective is to slowly alter the internal chemistry of the organization, turning a cohesive unit into a toxic, paranoid environment where no one trusts anyone else. The intelligence vacuum. While you are smiling and playing the loyal servant, you must be a sponge for information. Learn the hidden locations of their resources, discover their unstated weaknesses, and map out their future plans. Because they trust you, they will willingly hand you the exact blueprints required for their destruction. The delayed exit. The final blow is often simply removing yourself at the most critical, devastating moment. Having made yourself structurally indispensable, your sudden, unexplained absence during a crisis will cause the entire weakened edifice to collapse. Ultimately, the inner front strategy is the darkest and most demanding art of warfare. It requires you to operate for long periods in enemy territory, constantly suppressing your true intentions and fighting a war where your primary weapons are a warm smile and a hidden dagger. Chapter 32. Dominate while seeming to submit, the passive-aggressive strategy. In a modern society that heavily condemns overt, physical aggression, direct confrontation is often a massive liability. If you attack someone openly, you give them a clear target, you alienate onlookers, and you invite immediate retaliation. The passive-aggressive strategy is the ultimate evolution of warfare for a civilized age. It is the dark art of fighting without ever appearing to fight, masking your destructive intentions beneath a flawless veneer of compliance, innocence, or sheer incompetence. The core philosophy. When you meet an aggressive adversary with equal aggression, you enter a predictable, exhausting battle of attrition. But if you appear to yield, you completely disarm their kinetic energy. The master of passive aggression acts like quicksand. The more the enemy fights, shouts, and demands, the deeper they sink into frustration. By playing dumb, acting helpless, or deliberately misunderstanding instructions, you create an invisible, maddening friction. Your opponent is slowly driven insane because they cannot logically justify attacking you. After all, you are being so helpful and obedient, yet their grand plans are constantly being derailed by your subtle sabotage. Key execution tactics. Weaponized compliance. Sometimes the most devastating way to destroy an organization or an opponent's plan is to follow their rules to the absolute, literal letter. By stripping away all common sense, initiative, and flexibility, you can effectively halt their progress while remaining technically faultless. If they complain, you simply point out that you were strictly following their orders. The power of helplessness. Feign incompetence or a lack of understanding. When you make deliberate, strategic mistakes, apologize profusely and look incredibly sincere. Your opponent will exhaust their vital energy trying to fix your errors, micromanaging you, or dealing with the guilt of being angry at someone so seemingly helpless. The guilt trip. Shift the moral burden entirely onto your adversary. React to their normal requests as if they are acting like a tyrant, sigh heavily, look exhausted, and play the victim. A leader who is consumed by guilt or worried about looking like a bully is a hesitant, weak, and easily manipulated opponent. The art of delay. Never explicitly say no. Saying no invites an argument. Instead say yes, but indefinitely delay the execution. forget documents, miss deadlines by a fraction, or constantly ask for further clarification. You bleed the momentum out of their campaign without ever giving them a concrete reason to declare war on you. Ultimately, this strategy requires the absolute suppression of your own ego. You must swallow your pride, endure appearing subservient or foolish, and calmly watch as your deliberate lack of resistance causes your enemy to completely lose their emotional control. Chapter 33. Sow uncertainty and panic through acts of terror. The chain reaction strategy. In the ultimate extremity of asymmetrical warfare, when an adversary is so completely outmatched in conventional strength, wealth, and manpower that standard engagement is impossible, they are forced to utilize the most terrifying and misunderstood weapon in the strategic arsenal: pure, distilled psychology. The chain reaction strategy, often manifested as terrorism or acts of extreme, unpredictable disruption, recognizes that the human mind is intensely fragile. A conventional military strike seeks to physically destroy the enemy's ability to fight. An act of terror, however, is a piece of bloody theater. The physical damage is secondary, often minuscule compared to the resources of the larger state. The true objective is to shatter the enemy's will to fight by infecting their imagination with uncontrollable panic. The core philosophy. Terror is a multiplier of force. It relies on the psychological reality that human beings are paralyzed by what they cannot see, cannot predict, and cannot understand. By striking in locations normally considered absolute safe havens, cafes, civilian transport, or quiet neighborhoods, the strategist obliterates the enemy's illusion of security. The strategy is called a chain reaction because the initial act of violence is merely a spark. The real destruction is carried out by the victims themselves. The targeted society's imagination takes over, magnifying the threat 1,000-fold. The media amplifies the panic, the public demands immediate safety, and the government or leadership is pressured into making hasty, irrational decisions. Key execution tactics. The target is the audience, not the victim. In this strategy, the actual victims of the strike are merely props. The true target is the audience watching the aftermath. The goal is to send a gruesome, unmistakable message to the survivors. You are not safe, your leaders cannot protect you, and we can strike anywhere at any time. Provoking the overreaction. The most critical goal of this strategy is to bait the massively superior opponent into lashing out blindly. When a large power is terrified and humiliated by a tiny invisible force, their ego demands a massive, kinetic response. They often enact draconian security measures, suppress civil liberties, or launch massive military campaigns that kill innocents. This overreaction is exactly what the terrorist wants. It drains the larger power's resources, alienates their allies, and instantly creates thousands of new sympathizers and recruits for the radical cause. The giant effectively punches itself in the face. The illusion of omnipresence. A small group cannot be everywhere, but by acting with extreme suddenness and complete disregard for conventional moral boundaries, they create the terrifying illusion that they are everywhere. The defense. How to counter the strategy. Because terror is a purely psychological weapon, the only effective countermeasure is psychological discipline. Robert Greene emphasizes that the ultimate defense against this strategy is absolute, unwavering rationality. If you are targeted by this kind of asymmetric disruption, you must recognize it for what it is: the desperate tactic of the weak. You must refuse to give them the chain reaction they desperately need. Do not panic. Do not allow fear to dictate your policy or your life. Do not launch a massive, blind counterattack that plays into their hands. By remaining stoic, analyzing the actual physical limitations of the threat, and responding with precise surgical and unemotional countermeasures, you starve the terror of its oxygen. When the chain reaction fails to materialize, the strategy entirely collapses. Conclusion of the text. This concludes the deep summaries of all 33 chapters of Robert Greene's The 33 Strategies of War. The overarching thesis of the book is that the world is a fiercely competitive, often hostile environment. Whether on a literal battlefield, in a corporate boardroom, or navigating personal relationships, those who operate purely on emotion, ego, and wishful thinking will be devoured. True strategic dominance is achieved by cultivating a cold, Odyssean rationality, mastering your own internal weaknesses, viewing reality exactly as it is without illusion, and continuously adapting your maneuvers to outthink, outpace, and outmaneuver your adversaries.